Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Had Two Secret Identities? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. If you told Izuku Midoriya that he would be standing before Hero Corps students at UA watching Kaken practically wither from his gaze under tinted glasses, he would have called you crazy, told you your girlfriend was cheating on you, regardless if it was true or not, and then punched you for good measure. But that was the situation he found himself in. Kaken had folded into himself and was shaking with repressed rage because he knew that Izuku had more power in that moment. He knew it probably made him a bad person that he enjoyed it. But did he care? Hell no. He had abandoned morals along with personal safety a year ago. He was perfectly aware that he had crawled out of a garbage can, and frankly that was exactly the look he was going for. He hadn't cut his dark green hair in over a year and hadn't brushed it in nearly as long. It was pulled into a loose bun with a rainbow hair tie he had found on the pavement outside. He wore a beaten and stained aviator jacket with unintentionally distressed black jeans along and a t-shirt for a band that he hoped no one looked up. Emerald eyes peered predatorily at the class from under aviator sunglasses. There was also, of course, the handcuff that hung from one of his wrists that he could feel eyes being drawn to. He knew exactly what the class was thinking. Why the F is this trash gremlin here? And oh boy was that a story. It had all started when he had jumped out a window. Now, to many that may be slightly concerning, for Izuku it was just a normal Tuesday. It wasn't his fault that the cops had happened to see him smack a villain upside the head with a baseball bat because the heroes were useless as per usual. Said villain had decided to break into an appliance store and steal a fridge. For some odd reason, Izuku might be able to respect it if it was something decent like a 56-inch flat-screen TV, only to be met with a hard smack of a bat that Izuku had pulled from his backpack. And of course, the cops finally decided to arrive just in time to see the assault. That had prompted a chase through the city with Izuku darting through back alleys and dodging the random pedestrian but never loosing the unwanted police entourage. The chase ended up with him being cornered in the third floor of an abandoned building with cops surrounding the only exit. God, the lengths these people go for a teenager who only made one villain concuss. "Young man, I'm going to ask you put your hands up and kick that backpack over to me," said the cop at the front of the others. Izuku scoffed and lit a cigarette, if only to antagonize the cops, because what's better than doing something illegal right in front of authority? But yeah, like hell he was going to give them his backpack. There was some expensive shit in there. The bat, an axe, an illegally owned handgun, a bar of Dove chocolate. His mind didn't supply any obvious escape routes, so that left only one option. The 3-story drop to the hard pavement. Well, a 4-story drop didn't kill him, so he doubted this one would. Plus, he had all the full intention of dying in the first one. And so with a running leap, he crashed through the window, glass cascading into the street as he fell and tugging at his jacket. Crumple your body to lessen the impact. Roll when you hit the ground. Surprisingly enough, he didn't suffer any injuries other than a slight twinge in his ankle and a scraped knee. He heard shouts of outcry and he spared a quick glance back up at the window to see the cops leaning out the window with a mix of concern and rage. With a small bow, he booked it. If his psychiatrist had seen that little stunt, he would no doubt readmitted to the loony bin he had spent 6 weeks of his life in. If his psychiatrist saw half of the sheet, he would no doubt the readmitted. Ever since the accident, he had taken up a new philosophy, eloquently called "a few and everyone else." As far as he was concerned, Deku had died in the fall. After 6 weeks of daily therapy and some very needed venting sessions, he had been reborn. Risen from the ashes of his shattered dreams into the bat-wielding maniac he was today. His mother had pulled him out of school, so he was now being homeschooled, which led to insane amounts of free time for him to get into all sorts of trouble. Boredom was his main adversary in his quest to not spiral back into the pit of hell he had been unknowingly living in. Boredom had at first been a great motivator to get into shape. He had been doing parkour, free running, boxing, gymnastics, and Koryu for quite a while. Once he found out he would never develop a quirk, he realized that he had to hone his body if he even stood a chance. So he had been doing classes once a week and had a fairly decent base. Now he did a class for each every day and was improving at an insane pace that baffled even his teachers. But soon he found that even with the intense physical training, he still found himself bored. So he had gone searching. And what he found? He had learned fairly quickly that he was much more perceptive than most people around him. His psychiatrist called him a Sherlock Holmes, whoever the F that was, and on multiple occasions, and he had often solved petty crimes before even the police. He attributed this to the now-burned hero analysis notebooks he had been writing since he was 4. Due to this, he realized that it was surprisingly easy to find blackmail on people along with learning things about them at just a glance. As soon as he figured that out, he began to hone those skills until he had achieved a bit of a reputation. It really wasn't much, but he had wrapped a few people around his finger. He had even become an informant for a few vigilantes or minor heroes. Now, he wouldn't call himself either of those, and he has chosen to remain an entirely neutral party. There was really no reason behind it other than he had been bored and decided to do something with the skills he had. But sometimes he couldn't stave off the boredom, and that always led to some memorable moments, such as mixing things with his antidepressants or ending up in police custody for some odd reason he could never quite remember. Adrenaline junkie had flashed across his mind more than once, so points for self-awareness. His basic schedule went along the lines of something like this. 6 a.m. Wake up from the imaginary sleep. 7 a.m. Homeschool. 11 a.m. Whatever bullshit he could get himself into. 3 to 8 p.m. Physical classes. 9 p.m. Basic information gathering. 12 m. More reckless bullshit. Rinse and repeat. His mother was hardly ever home, so everything worked out. Dimly he was aware that today had been the day for UA's entrance exams and he couldn't give less of a shit. He had made peace with the realization that he couldn't be a hero and frankly had better things to do than play in the dream of every 3-year-old ever. Right now it was 1:32 in the morning and the rest of the day had passed with little drama, and Jesus Christ, he was bored. For once nothing was happening in the city, and perched on the top of a skyscraper in one of the worst parts of the city. There was a cigarette hanging from his lips as he let his mind wander. He had this thing where he often couldn't remember how he got to where he was, and right now had absolutely no idea how he had gotten up here or how he was going to get down. He would probably pick the lock on the door and saunter out of the building, leaving some very confused security guards in his wake. A sudden thought possessed him, and he had never been very good at ignoring his bad ideas, so he figured why not. He pulled out his lockpicks and began to shimmy the lock on the maintenance door when there was a large rush of air, and with a bored expression, he turned around very slowly to see the outline of a very large and very muscled man. His hair was unmistakable and his smile seemed to be generating its own light. All might. Never fear for I dash. He had long ago murdered his obsession with heroes and wasn't reduced to the weeping fanboy he would have been a year ago. Instead, he cut him off and with a bit more poison than he anticipated said, "Zip it heen. Spare me the speech, I'm fine." All Might looked a little taken aback because that was a reaction he didn't experience often. He was still blinking in surprise when Izuku turned back to the door and finally got it to open. The youth dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel and pocketed the lockpicks. He gave All Might a wave from behind and slammed the door in his face. Toshinori stood frozen, staring at the door that he had just been so rudely dismissed by. That had never happened before. Usually, when he met someone that boy's age, they tried to hide their awe, but he had never been met someone that didn't care. The entire reason he was here was due to Aizawa, so maybe he had planned it. It sounded like something Shota would do. The story he had been told was that Shota was on the hunt for a boy who frequented the shadier parts of the city, and he had started to amass an army of people he held something over. He had no codename and hadn't made any move to use the information. But it was how villains were born, so they had wanted to put an end to it before it metastasized into something less benign. Shota had found a video of the boy when he had shown it to the police to see if they knew anything. They had all consecutively groaned. Apparently, he was a bit of a problem child and had had multiple run-ins with the law, but nothing that was less than noble, and charges that never seemed to go through. If anything, he seemed to be more of a vigilante. The boy's file had revealed that his name was Izuku Midoriya, and he looked familiar, but Toshi couldn't put his finger on it. He had been surprised when he learned he was Quirkless, but when he had read that he was clinically depressed and had attempted suicide last year, his heart had cried for the child. He was much too young to wish to die. So when Aizawa had called him saying that Midoriya was seen at the top of a skyscraper, he had feared the worst. After all, he had jumped from the top of the school and lived. If he were to jump from the skyscraper, he would definitely not survive. Thankfully, whatever he was doing up there seemed to be harmless. He had caught him trying to break back in the building and was smoking a cigarette. He disapproved of the cancer stick. But the boy was interesting. An air of mystery surrounded him, and he had to admit that his coldness stung a bit. He secretly hoped they would meet again under much more fortunate circumstances. It wasn't until a week later that that experience caught up with him. Izuku had once again found himself in the custody of the police for underage driving. But honestly, F that. He had been chasing this random dude who decided to snatch his wallet. So he naturally grabbed the nearest motorcycle and took off after the guy. When they had caught him, but not the thief, they had slapped HHFS on him, and Izuku raised a green eyebrow and whispered, "Kanging," under his breath, which made one of the female cops snort. Inko couldn't be reached, mostly due to the fact that Izuku had long ago blocked the police's number on her phone, and they ran through a series of events and what was going to happen. Izuku only sighed. He knew how this was going to work. They would unsuccessfully try to intimidate him, they would review their paperwork, they would find the massive loopholes in the system, they would return dejected because he was quirklessness, they couldn't do anything, and bing bada boom, he was free to go. Honestly, why did they even try? But you can imagine his surprise when the police walked in with two people that had no reason to be there. First, it was All Might, his large stature filling the holding room. Izuku only gazed at him with a disinterested eye. The man next to him was much more interesting anyway. He looked like a much older version of Izuku with dark tangled hair and tired eyes that rivaled Izuku's. A large scarf was tied around his neck and looked overall really done with everything. He immediately decided he loved the guy. Something about his was familiar, but he couldn't quite figure out what exactly it was. "Well, hello, people I either don't know or don't care about," Izuku said with an overly bright smile. "What you doing here?" "We're here to talk about what we found in your backpack," the dark-haired man's hoarse and exhausted voice replied. Yeah, he was currently down an axe, a bat, a handgun, a small sword, and of course, his prized notebooks of information and blackmail. "Look, the weapons aren't mine." The man raised an eyebrow. "We aren't here for that impressive assault." So they were here for the notebooks then. He could probably figure out why, but his insomnia was catching up with him, and he didn't particularly care at that moment. Good to know. "So why is Mr. G.I. Joe here?" "No offense, Mr. All Might, sir, but he doesn't seem like the best person for anything other than illegal weapons, and I feel like he had better things to do than deal with it." 15-year-old who stole a motorcycle, he shouted the last part, flipping off whichever cop was unlucky enough to be behind the one-way glass. The man seemed thoroughly unamused, and All Might looked surprised at his blatant disrespect for authority. "It's about the notebooks." "Yeah, I figured." "How did you get that information?" I asked. The man didn't buy that for a second. "What does it matter to you?" The man sighed before rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "I've been keeping an eye on someone who seemed to have blackmail on a fifth of that part of the city." "I'm flattered, but it's more like a sixth. And Nedzu took interest in you, so when we were told you got arrested, he sent us with a proposition." Izuku actually leaned back for that. Well, that was a curveball. Out of everything, that was not even on the first 10 pages of possibilities. Nedzu, the slightly sadistic principal of UA, had taken interest in a quirkless nobody. "What is it?" The man looked as impassive as he had the entire conversation when he said, "He wants you to be his personal student. You wouldn't be with any of the other classes and would be more like a student teacher." What in the F dash? This had come out of absolutely nowhere, and he couldn't count all the plot holes on his fingers. What does he want in return? There was no way that he didn't want something in return. Just a different perspective on the students and what they could do to improve. He feels they could benefit from an instructor in their own age level. Every part of his body screamed at him not to accept. There were too many red flags, and it was so entirely unrealistic it was almost laughable. But he had never been known for a good sense of self-preservation. Sure. All Might had been sitting quietly, watching the exchange in silence and offering no input when he suddenly jumped up and pointed at Izuku. "I remember where I know you from." The dark-haired man raised an eyebrow as the number one hero continued. "I saved you from a sludge villain last year and you asked me if I could be a hero without a quirk." Izuku finished for him, eyes hard and half-closed. "And I said no." "Indeed you did. Thanks for that, by the way. That dream needed to die anyway." All Might had suddenly gone silent as he connected the dots. He had been the final push that shoved Midoriya over the edge. The guilt that blossomed in his chest was almost enough to cripple him and revert him back to his true form. "Well anyway, when does this special tutelage start?" The man seemed very interesting in the drama between him and All Might but replied to the question all the same. "Tomorrow at normal school hours." "Great, see you then." He flashed a smile at the duo before screaming at the top of his lungs. "Now can some beast uncuff me so I can go home and take FNP? I have a fist fight scheduled with God at 8 o'clock. You all know perfectly well you can't touch me." At that precise moment, Aizawa realized that it was probably the worst idea Nezu had ever had. Izuku's first day did not start well. First off, his alarm didn't go off and he had no time to get ready. But then again, his version of get ready was drowning a pot of coffee in the space of 3 minutes and throwing on some questionably clean clothes. Due to his tardiness, he couldn't jumpstart his neurons with normal caffeine, so he grabbed one of the already made bottle that consisted of coffee, 5-hour energy, Monster, and Red Bull. So not exactly healthy, but one cannot be a living corpse on his first day of tutelage with the world's one and only rat bear thing. His second and possibly more annoying obstacle was being arrested again. Alright, this one was actually not his fault. He saw this man covered in spikes drag a struggling young woman into an alley and he wasn't stupid enough to not know what was about to happen. He might be a bad guy, just not a bad guy. So naturally he attacked the guy. It was actually really pathetic how easy it was to take him down. It only took a well-timed kick to the head and the guy was out. The woman nearly broke into tears in gratitude, but Izuku needed to get going now, so he told the woman to call the police as he booked it out of there. Only to run point blank into a cop. Jesus, the universe hated him. Do not be fooled, behind this cop's blubbery face and handlebar mustache burned a hate for Izuku to rival the flames of hell. He took one look at the sobbing woman, the comatose would-be attacker, and Izuku's panicked expression before slapping on a pair of HAVs on both him and the criminal. The woman had pleaded that Izuku hadn't done anything wrong, but Mr. Donut Walrus was having no of it under the pretense of assault. Izuku just glared at him and said with a deadly calm voice, "You know perfectly well what would have happened if I didn't intervene. Sure, let's go ahead and say it was assault, but if that's how we are playing the legal system, you have the moral backbone of scented candle." At this, Sir Evil Cop had the audacity to be offended, waving a fat finger in his face, going off about respecting his elders and keeping his mouth shut. Izuku felt his temper mount but just huffed when Mr. Donut walked away to call this into the station. Now was the perfect time to make a break for it. So he did. Bolting across the street, hands still cuffed, he heard the shouts of Rent-A-Cop yelling at him to stop and his heavy footsteps in his half-hearted attempt to chase after him. Soon enough he found himself at the gates of U, only half an hour behind schedule. His hair was in a literal afro because of sweat and humidity. Luckily for him, he found a discarded rainbow hair tie on the floor just outside the building and pulled his dark green hair into a dark bun, trying to make an at least decent impression. At some point on his sprint to the school, he had managed to liberate one of his hands from the cold steel prison. The other, however, remained stubbornly attached to his wrist. He wandered into the school, not even pausing to stand in awe at the fact that he was entering the school of his dead dreams. He had changed, heroes no longer entranced him and villains didn't seem quite so villainous. The only reason he was doing this was to try and stave some of the boredom that nipped at his heels like he had Kaken's as children. Kaken. He had gotten into UA, hadn't he? Oh, that was just too good. Ever since his suicide attempt, he and Kaken had reached an unsteady neutral ground. He had come to visit him in the hospital to say that was a shitshow was an understatement. Although, they had somewhat settled some of their differences during that particular screaming match. He looked back at his time at the mental ward with fond memories that involved being chased across the hospital and his psychiatrist busting down a door just to call him a demon and then leave. There was of course the time when he had attempted to find a way to avoid the insomnia his meds caused, which led to 2 days and 3 notebooks full of incredibly detailed drawings of heroes in various stages of death and conspiracy theories about how quirks were corrupting society and how they should be abolished, leaving the quirkiness to rule the world. Good times. Anyway, he needed to meet Nizu and get a better hand on what this special teaching even entailed. He wandered the halls of it aimlessly. Some tiny nagging voice in the back of head informed him of details he truly didn't care about. Like how this was the first day of school for the normal students, the basic layout plans, and the ever so useful knowledge of what the walls were made of. Did his brain ever shut up? Finally locating the teacher's lounge, he figured that would be a good place to start looking for the principal. Inside the lounge was a coffee machine, plush couches, and a microwave. All essential items. Only one person other than Izuku occupied the room, a skeletal man with lanky blonde hair and blue eyes with black scaras. He looked so weak a small breeze could blow him over. With a small nod in the man's direction, Izuku asked, "Sup, All Might. Any idea where I could find Nedzu?" All Might basically jumped out of his skin at his recognition in his true form. "Why, he stuttered. Izuku scoffed. Please, he had been prophesying the fact that All Might had a significantly different and weaker form due to some sort of strength quirk for months. It really didn't take much brain power to connect the dots and realize that this living skeleton was All Might. "No, I don't," he replied with a deadpan expression, voice practically dripping with sarcasm. How? Bless this poor man's soul. Izuku actually sighed at that one and rubbed his temples. "Look, Superman, I really don't have time to walk through basic logic with you. I am already late, seeing I got held up on my way here." He held up his still handcuffed wrist, "and I don't want Nedzu being any more sad than he might already be. So I will repeat, where is the mammal?" All Might was still reeling but pointed down the hall. "Take a left." Izuku smiled, a tiny bit of madness sneaking into his eyes. "Gracias, Bumblebee." Nedzu's office was exactly where He-Man had said it would be. He entered to find the mammal sipping tea from a porcelain cup, staring at nothing with rapt attention. "I was beginning to wonder if you were ever going to show," the principal said, eyes not even shifting to meet Izuku's. "Oh, so this was what they were doing. I was beginning to wonder if I would ever get here." Izuku replied just as curtly as he swept in and spun a chair around and sat so his head was perched on the chair's back. Ever the picture of an uncaring teen with a slight rebellious streak. Nedzu smiled and finally made eye contact, beady black eyes boring into Izuku's green ones. He expected Izuku to back down, to flinch and look down at the floor cowed. He did no such thing. Instead he stared back with a bored expression but fierce fire smoldering slightly behind his irises. The principal smiled for real now and clapped his paws. "Wonderful, you have a backbone. Wonderful, just wonderful," he exclaimed. Izuku raised an ungroomed eyebrow. "Well, seeing as we are already late, I'm afraid we will have to skip the pleasantries and get straight to business." Nedzu pushed a manila folder towards the teen. "To start you off, I'm placing you with the 1A class to observe and help them develop their quirks and assist their teachers in any way possible. Our lessons will be more hands-on, so I am authorizing you the same authority as the teachers here." Well, that was a mouthful. He flipped through the folder and found profiles for every student in the 1A class. Kaken was in the class along with Shudo Todoroki. That would be amusing as all hell. One question nagged at the back of his mind, however. Why exactly did you think I would be good enough for this? I don't have a quirk and my morals are questionable at best. I can't help but feel underqualified. Nizu laughed before turning deadly serious. "You are being much too modest. Whether you realize it or not, if you truly wanted to, you could turn Japan into your personal playground. It doesn't take much to get someone to fall under your influence. Only one bit of information and they are yours. I figured it would be better if we got you with us before the villains." Izuku smiled bashfully, but inside his mind, he was in hysterics. If only you realized that you are too late. Aizawa was not particularly happy at his new student teacher's arrival. Izuku on the other hand fell more in love with the man when he saw that he had bundled himself in a sleeping bag and was laying on the floor like a caterpillar sipping a juice pouch. What an absolute mood. Specifically, it was Izuku's mood. 24. If a pro hero could do that, then could he come to school in a sleeping bag too? We have an assistant with us this year. He is Nedzu's personal student, so I expect you to treat him with respect. Eraserhead monologued. Oh yes, he had done so research and had learned that the man who had been there for his recruitment was none other than Eraserhead, an underground hero who hated the spotlight. His type of dude. The class was already nervous out of their minds, being this was their first day, but at the news of an assistant they all perked up. But when Izuku had walked into the room with his wild hair, aviator glasses, and trashy clothes, their expressions flipped between disappointed and confused. Kaken, of course, had recognized him immediately and looked to be visibly restraining himself from saying or doing something violent. He will be helping me analyze your quirks and help you train them, Aizawa said monotone. Izuku apprised the class with a trained eye, careful to let only a sharp glint be seen through the glasses. He adjusted his posture to appear confident and commanding, only to immediately let it return to normal because he realized he didn't care. I'm Izuku Midoriya, your new resident trainer apparently. More eyes landed on his HNs. I honestly have no effing clue why I'm here, all I know is that I got arrested yesterday and then boom, I have a job. Aizawa glared at him, but Izuku only turned to him and said, wait, am I even getting paid for putting up with these brats? Izuku didn't miss the smile that tugged at his lips for a millisecond before it turned back to its granite mask. He was winning him over then. No, you are not. Now everyone needs to put on their gym uniforms and meet us on the field. While the students were getting ready, Aizawa moved to talk with Izuku. Probably tell him what the hell he was planning and what was his role in it. I'm conducting a quirk assessment test. You will be watching the students and see what they could do to improve them. Aizawa's bloodshot eyes lingered on Izuku. I really don't want you here, but if you're as good as Ndizu thinks you are, better not disappoint. Izuku gave him his most annoying smile. Why would you ever underestimate me? After all, I have a sixth of the city wrapped around my finger. The first few students had begun to trickle onto the field, and Eraserhead explained the quirk assessment while Izuku not so inconspicuously lit a cigarette and observed. A girl with short brown hair inquired about the orientation, and Aizawa's answer led to an almost comical round of gasps. When he had asked Kaken to throw a softball using his quirk, Izuku couldn't help but be impressed with his 705.2 meters. Kaken had really grown. But then Aizawa had dropped the bomb that the lowest scoring in this exercise would be expelled. He scoffed at how the students reacted to the obvious lie. Did none of them have actually functioning brains? Soon enough the 50-meter dash commenced and Eraserhead joined Izuku on the sidelines. He glanced at the cigarette before sighing and returning his attention back to the students. Tenya Ida's quirk was practically built for this test, but they would have to work on to getting to a higher gear faster. As they ran through the roster, Izuku pulled out his water bottle of pure caffeine that he hadn't had a chance to drink yet. Aizawa eyed the bottle hungrily, and Izuku knew that he was just as tired, if not more so, due to the bags under his eyes. Would you like some? What even is it? Coffee, 5-hour energy, Monster, and Red Bull. Eraserheads considered it for a moment before extending his hand. He took a swig of the concoction, and in seconds his pupils dilated and he looked a bit more alert. Another step in the direction of befriending the underground hero. Soon enough the tests were coming to a close and the last few people were completed the softball throw when the same brown-haired girl from before, wasn't her name like Uruaka or something, brought up the idea of making Izuku try the test. Deku might have tensed up, but knew Izuku didn't even glance up from his notes when he said, I don't have a quirk. The general uproar this statement caused was almost comical. Why are you even here then? Ida's voice shouted over the din. It was quickly seconded by a majority of the class, so Izuku just sighed before looking towards the student body. He pointed at Ida. Your brother is Ingenium. You want desperately to become just as good as a hero as him and keep your family's name alive. Total busybody, but that doesn't take much to figure out. You are extremely straightforward and jump to conclusions. Despite your humble nature, you are also vengeful and can abandon your own moral code in order to achieve revenge. Ida stood with his mouth agape, but Izuku didn't pause. Now he turned to attention to Uraraka. You're here because of your parents. Not in the way Todoroki is. I want to talk to you about your mother later, by the way, Shudo, but because you want to give them a life where they don't have to worry about money. You are extremely empathetic but are also fierce, and if you incorporated physical fighting with your quirk, you could make major progress into getting that money for your parents. The entire class was silent, too surprised about the analysis of their classmates to make a sound other than Kaken's grumbling. How do you know all that? Uraraka questioned, still stunned beyond all belief. Simple observations. Now, does anyone else have any objections about my being here? Kaken apparently had multiple objections. Being that he snapped and flew at Izuku, shouting, "I do you a-hole. The F, are you even doing here, do?" With one smooth motion, Izuku had his right arm in an arm lock just waiting to be snapped. You always start with a right hook. I recommend you fix that, Kaken. His comment about Todoroki's mother had been forgotten by everyone other than Todoroki. He approached Izuku later that day with his stone-cold expression. What do you know about my mother? Izuku looked up from his notes and smiled softly when he saw Todoroki. Your mother was in the same hospital I was in, and she became one of my best friends. I've briefly met your sister and I know about everything that happened between all of you. Todoroki stiffened minutely before speaking, and your point? I want to bring Enduhor to justice. Night had fallen in the city, casting deep shadows into the alley Izuku was meandering down, earphones blasting rock music full volume as he read posts on the Hero Forum. He had once been such an active member on the forum that he had almost made him an admin, but then they found out he was only a kid, and although they were thoroughly impressed by his analysis of the heroes, they couldn't let a child be running the website. After his accident and thorough smashing of his dreams, he had gone completely silent on the website and had seriously contemplated deleting his account, but then realized that it was a wonderful way of receiving information, and ever since Aizawa had said that he had a fifth of the city wrapped around his finger, he resolved to make that statement true. At least Izuku Midoriya needed to get a fifth of the city wrapped around his finger. He still couldn't get over how he hadn't been recognized. The pro-heroes were just as disappointing in person as they seemed when he observed them during villain attacks. They had not only missed recognizing one wanted man but two. It was almost impressive. He had honestly expected more from Nedzu. He had been almost 100% positive that he was at least recognized one of his secret identities. He was still pretty sure they were trying to play him until Nizu had said they wanted to get him before the villains. But Witch and Beetle were still at large, and an entire school of pro-heroes had no idea that they were teaching among. That actually made him giggle. Right in the middle of a dark alley at midnight. That probably looked insane. But if the fact that a vigilante and a villain were currently teaching at the best hero school in Japan wasn't a reason to start giggling uncontrollably, then he didn't know what was. Which had been created before Beetle. Both had been almost total accidents. Which was a vigilante that had been born of pure spite of one-upping the heroes, and Izuku was nothing if not extra, so he had embraced the role with a passion unmatched by even the most passionate passion fruits. He had created a costume and designed his own weapons and had taken to the streets for his debut, crashing villain parties and stopping more serious crimes than Izuku's random thief. He may have lied on his mindless ramblings on the roof. He had first met All Might when he said he didn't consider himself an informant or a vigilante. That was true to an extent. Izuku wasn't an informant or a vigilante, but Witch and Beetle, not so much. Beetle dangled dangerously close to the line of villain. That idea had spawned when he realized how much easier it would be to take down villains if he got to know a few. And so Beetle was born, and that had honestly grown into something so much bigger than he had initially intended. It had originally started with him being a double agent for himself, then Beetle got out of hand and had taken up the role as an informant for the villains, and if Izuku was being totally honest, he didn't overly mind it. He had even made a few villain friends as Beetle, like Kurogiri, a dude with a warp gate quirk who was really just tired of dealing with the antics of the others like Toga, Dabi, and Shigaraki. That was probably another reason he kept his stupid forum account. Witch and Beetle both had their own pages, and it was honestly the highlight of his life whenever someone tried to figure out their quirks. for some reason, which had gotten like super popular. He had the whole shebang, self-insert fanfiction, NSFW fan art, and the occasional shipping war. There had once been someone who had tried to convince the rest of his fanbase that he and Beetle would be super compatible, and Izuku had spent half the day in near tears. If there was one thing he wasn't good at, it was self-love. He attributed Witch's popularity to his flair for dramatics, unique personality, and his very, very impressive escapes from custody. But tonight he hadn't donned Witch's ice blue braid or Beetle's fiery orange and yellow space buns. That had been Toga's idea, and it worked surprisingly well. As he had mentioned earlier, Izuku needed to get a fifth of the city wrapped around his finger, so he hadn't dyed his hair and was wearing his beloved aviator jacket. He was headed to his favorite information gathering spot in the city, and he was almost to its entrance. The door was as inconspicuous as they came, and if you didn't already know about it, you wouldn't even so much as glance at it. He cracked it open and confidently walked down the dusty steps, eyes adjusting to the harsh light, and his nostrils flared at the stench of sweat and blood. Encouraging shouts sounded from the bottom of the stairwell, followed by thumps and grunts. Reaching the bottom, he watched two unknown competitors throw punches and lunge at each other with brutal kicks and elbows. One had shoulder-length brown hair that hung in sweaty strands, while the other had skin so pale it looked translucent, and it took Izuku less than a moment to determine that the brown-haired man was going to win. He took a seat at the bar and continued to watch the fight with a nod at the barkeep, who passed him his usual order of tequila. Sure, they were both built like trucks and were handsome enough to appear in his wet dreams later, but the pale guy was losing stamina fast and was lashing out with absolutely no tact or planning. They both fought like uncultured swines, but at least the other one looked to have some form of plan. That's another reason he loved this place. He could make bank at betting on who would win these matches. He was almost never wrong. Add money making with loose-lipped patrons who were drunk on bloodlust and cocktails, and you had the makings of a perfect establishment. Sure enough, the pale man was flipped on his back and pronounced unconscious by the ref, who lifted the brown-haired man's arm into the air in triumph and asked if anyone wanted to challenge the current champion. Not a single person rose to the challenge, and Izuku couldn't help but roll his eyes. It would be so easy. I could do it. Are these idiots really too scared to actually go against that absolute goosefoot? Well, how about you try it, Pipsqueak? And that's when Izuku realized that he said that out loud, and the current reigning champion was staring at him with righteous fury, apparently not too keen on being called an absolute goosefoot. Well, one can't back down from a challenge. And if he calls my bluff, then I'll lose all my street cred. So he sighed and drowned the rest of his glass and handed off his coat to the barkeep, who cast him a sympathetic glance that he definitely didn't need. The entire room watched with bated breath as a scrawny 15-year-old stepped up to face off against a man who was about 3 times his size. He saw a few bets being placed mostly against him, but he noticed a few of the people who knew him casting them in his favor with crooked smiles. He mentally calculated how fast this fight was going to last, and he rounded it off at 2 minutes max. I can't fight like Witch does. He walked into his corner, and the other man, obviously surprised that he had actually risen to the challenge, stalked to his own, while the pretty pink-haired ref stood in the middle waiting to call the fight. She told them the rules: no using your quirks, no killing, etc. They both squared up, but Izuku had no intention of actually using his fists first. With a whistle, the ref stepped out of the ring, and the man flew at him just like he thought he would. He ducked and, centering all of his weight onto his left foot, kicked his right leg into the air so he was in a sideways splits and hit the man right under his chin, knocking his head into the air and for him to stagger back a step. Taking advantage of the momentary stun, he twisted so he was on the side of the man and took a jab at the space right between his ribs and his pelvis, but the man turned right before, so it didn't connect properly. Like the cretin he was, he once again tried to hit Izuku with his fists. Honestly, do they never learn? And had the audacity to be surprised when he only found air as he dodged. Running through possible plans, he decided that he could go for pressure points, or Izuku could give the audience a show. Being a dramatic beach, he, of course, chose the showier option. Jumping up and taking the man's still outstretched arm between his legs, he let gravity drag both him and the man onto the floor with a thud. He unlocked his legs and rolled onto his feet as the man was getting over the surprise that he had been dragged to the floor by a 15-year-old who looked like he had crawled out of a dumpster. Thankfully, The man had a decent recovery time and was almost standing when an elbow jammed him in the throat. Retching for air had gasped and clawed at this throat, but before he could recover, Izuku decided to bruise his knuckles just for the novelty of it and jumped. Because he was short enough, he couldn't reach the man's face without jumping, pulling his arm back before hearing his fist connect with the man's jaw with a satisfying crack. Head spun so fast to the side that he got whiplash. The man stumbled and Izuku sighed. No one thought they could take this. Before casually walking behind him and tripping him with an outstretched foot. He landed on his but with a thud, and within moments Izuku's foot was on his throat, poised to crush his windpipe. The ref called the whistle and the room did what could only be described as exploded with cheers as people pointed and Wolf whistled at Izuku, who removed his foot from a new extremely embarrassed competitor. He flashed a smirk at the crowd before strutting out of the ring back to bar with a raised middle finger. The bartender threw him back his jacket with an odd expression before passing him another shot of tequila. Soon enough he had amassed a small crowd of people eagerly asking how he had done that, and Izuku soon came to the conclusion that bloodthirsty, drunk, and astonished patrons were the best combination for information extraction. They were all too compliant to share personal information, and with a few well-timed minutes of silences on Izuku's part, he had the entire life story of 3 men and could gather that one of them was having an affair, the second had eloped with a girl he no longer loved, and the third had about 7 girlfriends. He quickly typed this information onto one of the notes titled Blackmail on his phone along with the men's names. You'll never know when you needed info on a stranger who was random at the time. It continued like this for another hour, his notes growing longer and longer until they had reached the max limit, and he decided he was done for the night. With a wave of his hand, he excused himself and strutted out into the alleyway. He would definitely need to participate in the fights more often. His clock read 4:34 a.m. when he crawled through the window into his room and flopped onto his bed. In the faint light of the street lamp outside his window, he could see the empty spaces on his walls where the posters for All Might had once been hung and the missing figurines that had stood vigil on his desk all those years. Now it was bare and he hadn't found time to redecorate. He felt tears start to prick the corners of his eyes at the thought of the memorabilia that had played such an integral part in his childhood, that had worshipped the man that had crushed his dreams. He didn't really blame All Might. He was being realistic and hadn't been wrong, but you can't exactly let the destruction of the tiny bit of hope that he had harbored for so long get snuffed out by a few harsh words. Maybe that's why he had been driven to do it. Maybe he just wanted to get back at Kaken. Maybe. R.I.P. He needed to get out that pity party right now. If he went down that road, he really didn't want to know where it would lead. He doubted he would get to sleep without those thoughts swirling around and keeping him up. So, he dragged himself over to his desk and reviewed his notes on Class 1A. He now was playing every court, villain, vigilante, and now hero. He still had a job to do, and he was hardly a slacker. He wondered if he could take Aizawa into giving him a day to do individual training on each of the students. He had some basic starting plans, but he hadn't seen enough of them to get concrete reads on them. Nisa might also decide to have him branch out to other classes, and that would add a substantial addition to his workload. Then there was the plan to deal with Enduhor. Todoroki looked very eager, and if anything Ray had told him was even remotely true, then he couldn't blame him. He hadn't had the pleasure to meet the man in person, but based on his basic profiling, he was a major a-hole. Of course, he could never support a man who abused his family. Just the thought made his blood boil. Oh, Enduhor would get what was coming to him, and he might just enlist Beetle and Witch's help in taking him down. This motherfucker isn't going to stand a chance. Izuku almost puked when All Might entered by proclaiming, "I am here," coming through the door like a normal person. How corny and idiotic could this guy get? He had literally seen him twice in the span of 2 days, and the very idea of having to ghost the class and spend time with the man was exhausting. It was almost enough to make him want to throw himself from a roof again. Geez, file that one away under things to never say in front of my therapist. It was an ever-growing file, and that was probably worrying. Anyway, back to Hime. Class 1A responded to the dramatic entrance with odd gasps, and one student, his name was like Kaminari or something, even stated the obvious, that it was really All Might, with wide eyes. And to think that a mere 10 months ago he would have been among them, with shining eyes and practically worshipping the man. They said to never meet your heroes, and he had yet to receive substantial evidence that whoever in this equation was wrong. The only person who even somewhat lived up to his expectations was Eraserhead, and he had already had Izuku's respect for avoiding the media like the plague and then had won his heart with his absolute ability to not care. They were kindred spirits, really. His gaydar was sending crazy signals whenever it was pointed at the older man, and it had never been wrong. He might have swooped in, but Aizawa and Present Mike were OTP. He would definitely have to set them up sometime. A locked closet might prove useful perhaps. I wonder what Aizawa would do if I wrote some Eraser Mike smut and sent it to him. Under a pseudonym, of course. Suddenly, an ingenious idea struck him. What if I send it as Beetle? That would be hilarious. See how he reacts to having a villain send him smut, saying that he shipped him with Present Mike. That would be priceless. Maybe show it to Toga, she would die. He resolved to do that at the first opportunity, Beetle screaming his agreement in the back of his mind. But then came the serious question. Should he write it purposefully bad or really well to make Aizawa question everything? He was interrupted from his fantasy by All Might's overly cheery booming voice, and young Midoriya will be observing with me. Blinking, he leaned back in his seat. What? All Might's grin faltered for a moment, and Izuku noticed he was wearing his Silver Age costume, and then promptly got mad at himself for knowing that. For the combat training, you will be observing with me and taking notes on how the students use their quirks in a real fight. They were doing combat training this early? Well, it didn't really matter. The faster he got acquainted with their quirks, the faster he could start training them to be better. Wait a minute, when did he start caring? That needed to stop immediately. But another part of being a hero is looking good. All Might bellowed, pointed at the far wall as it split open to reveal numbered boxes. The support team specially designed these for you based off the forms you turned in at the beginning of the year and your quirks. The round of cheers from the student body was almost deafening. I mean, God, they can help you with your quirks, but it was still just over-glorified fabric. Get dressed and meet us at Training Ground Beta. All Might gestured for Izuku to follow him, and he reluctantly stood and shuffled after the number one hero. Once outside, Izuku lit the cigarette, making Toshinori frown, but the muscled man said nothing. In fact, neither of them said anything until the student body had gathered and a few students glanced at the offending cancer stick hanging from Izuku's lips and wondered how he was getting away with it. They say that the costume makes the hero, and you are the living proof of that. All Might complimented, and even Izuku had to admit that they did look pretty good. Kaken had on giant gauntlets that resembled grenades on his wrist, and Izuku wondered how heavy it was and their purpose. Kaken may be an a-hole, but he wasn't an idiot. There was no reason he would wear such debilitating pieces unless they served as some other purpose. He also wore a mask, which Izuku thought was overkill, that grew into giant wing-like things that were supposed to resemble explosion tucked behind his ears with what? Barrettes? Abruptly, the thought of Kaken wearing a tiny barrette with dye written in flowery cursive came to mind, and he suddenly knew what he was getting Kaken for Christmas. Baraka, the girl with the anti-gravity quirk, wore a skin-tight bodysuit that loosely resembled No. 13's astronaut costume, but she was pulling at it, indicating that she had not intended it to be that tight. Ida Tenya, the boy with a speed quirk and whose brother was none other than Ingenium, looked like a cross between a knight and a robot, and it was almost identical to his brother's costume. And Shoto, oh Shoto. His costume literally covered his entire right side in ice. If he didn't know his quirk or his mother, then he would have just assumed it was a cosmetic choice. But since he did know his quirk and his mother, he knew that he had both fire and ice and absolutely refused to use his fire, out of spite for his a-hole father. He literally was trying to hide that part of him. Right? I got my own share of daddy issues, and Endeavor is still a major D. Who deserves to burn in hell? Too bad Satan already turned him down, but we need Avatar here to realize that his quirk is not his father's. As All Might explained how this exercise would work, 2 teams, heroes versus villains, blah blah blah. Izuku felt a pair of eyes on him, and he scanned the crowd until his green eyes met purple ones and they both narrowed. Hitoshi Shinso. Quirk. Brainwash. Can mentally control those who verbally answer him. Extremely useful and extremely dangerous. What did he want? They kept up their impromptu staring contest until Shinso apparently got intimidated by the tiny bit of Beetle's insanity slip into his gaze. He would need to watch him closely during this test. Then it was time to announce teams, and Ida got the unfortunate pairing of him and Bakugo vs Uruaka and Shinso. This will be one for the history books. Now if only I knew whose grave I should start digging first. Once they were gathered in the controls room, Toshinori nervously glanced at Midoriya, who was muttering under his breath as green eyes flicked across the screen, watching as the teams prepared. It would be young Ida and Bakugo as the villains and Uruaka and Shinso as the heroes. He knew he should be focusing on the students, but the guilt about what he had said that day to Midoriya was eating away at him and was hurting him more than any villain ever could. He knew this was a perfect time to bring it up, but he couldn't quite bring himself to broach the topic. Then Midoriya sighed and turned to look at him with an exasperated expression. "Look, I'm not going to tell anyone about your little secret." Toshi blinked. That hadn't even crossed his mind. Well, it was now or never. No, that isn't it. I just wanted to apologize for what I said that day and say that you can become a hero, even if you don't have a quirk. Midoriya scoffed, a little bit late for that. Toshi averted his gaze, guilt increasing at tenth-fold. Midoriya noticed the weight bearing down on the man's shoulders before exhaling through his nose and saying, "I don't blame you. You were right. You were right. I always knew that but never really acknowledged it." Add up a sudden realization that you've been lying to yourself for 14 years and suicide baits, and it makes a bit of a toxic explosion of negative emotion. Toshinori was taken aback. Suicide baits? Midoriya only shrugged. People didn't like me much at my old school. The #1 hero suddenly had the urge to track down every student who used to attend Midoriya's junior high and make them pay. In the end, the heroes had won, with Shinso baiting Kaken into replying to him in a rage-filled fury and Uruaka hitting Ida like a baseball with a concrete pillar. All in all, pretty standard. They awarded MVP to Ida and everyone agreed it was the correct choice. The rest of the exercise passed pretty uneventfully, the only interesting thing being Shoto freezing the entire building, show off, and Yaoyorozu actually drop-kicking Mineta out of a window. He deserved it. By the time he got home, he was stuck somewhere between bursting with energy and passing out on the floor. Seeing all of the students' battles had made him itch for a fight of his own, but the mental strain of analyzing all of their quirks had taken its toll. His phone pinged and made the decision of what to do for him. One of the hero forums had released an article about Witch's inactivity, and Izuku decided that was what he was going to do. At nightfall, he would become Witch, fight some criminals, save some folks, burn off some of his non-existent energy. Maybe an hour after sunset, he donned his black cloak with light blue thread embroidered the edges that had been a beach to-do, along with gray jeans and shirt. He located his bottle of hairspray dye thing he used to make his hair a light blue that washed out after one use. Plaiting it into a fishtail, he put on the finishing touch to the ensemble, a thin midnight blue cloth that he tied across his eyes that he could see perfectly out of but hid his identity well. There was also the signature black and blue witch's hat that gave him his name. He luckily didn't have to hide this from his mother. She was hardly ever home, having to work her butt off to pay for his hospital bills. Another drawback of his idiotic decision to jump from a 4-story building. Didn't he know that he could have survived? He snuck out his window before slipping into the shadows of the alleys and sunk into the persona of Witch. It was almost like acting, except he wasn't pretending to be someone else. He was becoming someone else. He developed new demeanors reflexively and his entire thought process shifted. He was still in control and could switch anytime he wished, but it was almost eerie. Which was reserved but sarcastic. Always willing to mess with the cops and often played right into their hands, only to escape again last second. His posture changed as he climbed onto the roof of a building in the business district and began running along the rooftops, avoiding the attention of the few people still milling about that evening, adopting a posture much more like Ida's stiffness instead of his perpetual slouch. He soon arrived at the abandoned penthouse apartment that had started to serve as his home base ever since he had discovered it on one of his escapades a month or two earlier. He retrieved Witch's weapons from where he stored them in neat racks. His arsenal consisted of a tactical whip that could be used much like Eraserhead's capture weapon, a carved wooden mage staff, and a tranquilizer gun. He also had a belt of throwing knives that although he knew how to use them he never had to use and hoped he wouldn't have to. They were lethal and he really didn't want to kill anyone. There was also the set of tiny lockpicks that he carried around with him constantly so he could escape from the police if need. When he was fully outfitted he stalked over to the corkboard that was covered in maps of various surrounding cities. He stopped 10 feet away at a small strip of white tape he had placed exactly for this reason. In one smooth motion he pulled a knife from his belt, closed his eyes, and flicked his wrist back and let it fly. Opening his eyes, he looked at the corkboard to see where the knife had impaled directly in the center of a map for Hosu. So that's where he was heading tonight. If he got on a train ASAP, he could make it in time for prime villain activity. That was another thing about which that differed from Izuku, which always had a system for everything while Izuku was constantly in disarray. After retrieving the knife he practically flew in the direction of the train, jumping along the flat rooflines of this district until he reached the train tracks. Catching a train was always a nerve-wracking experience. It was maybe one of the most dangerous things he did in his line of work. It involved a perfectly timed jump and then remaining perfectly still for the entirety of the ride. Riding atop a moving train was much harder than it looked, and staying alive was even harder. Tunnels were always the worst. If he didn't push himself flat on his stomach he would be vaporized instantly. The few passers-by gaped at the vigilante train surfing but which only cast a disinterested eye. Which didn't need publicity or to be a media star, he just a creature made entirely out of spite with a point to prove. He didn't shy away from the cameras but he didn't pose or wave or even acknowledge the existence of the photographers. In the back of his mind, Izuku itched to strike a pose, do a mock salute, flip them off even. Just something. Beetle laughed maniacally as he sensed Izuku's desperation, always one for inner turmoil, even if it was his own. Soon enough, he spots the familiar outline of Hosu, double and then triple checking to make sure that he wasn't missing any of his weapons. He braced his body to jump off of the train. He landed in an elegant roll that makes his cloak billow out behind him and the wind catch his braid. He sees the bright lights on a camera flash and he knows that that picture will be viral by morning. Izuku and Beetle both gasped in delight. Total drama beaches and attention whores. The idea of their face plastered over every website made them nearly faint. Which was much more sensible, however. The more publicity each of them got the easier it would be to compare images of the three of them and connect the dots that they were all the same person. Face remaining impassive he scrambled away from the tracks and melted into the shadows of the city. The tangled alleyways of Hosu were perfect villain territory and he wanted to get at least one tonight. It was 1:43 a.m. and the police thought they had him. Granted, he was currently sitting the back of a police cruiser handcuffed next to the villain he had captured earlier that night. The two cops in the front seat were bantering about how proud the detective would be of them for finally getting the vigilante that had caused him so many headaches in custody. Beetle and Izuku both simultaneously scoffed. Which was not an idiot, in fact, he was probably the most logical out of the three personas and did not blindly run into situations like the other two. He had procedures to follow in case this ever happened, and frankly, it happened more than he cared to admit. The Identities had already been picked and he was just waiting for the opportune moment to escape. The villain next to him had been strangely silent throughout this entire exchange and Beetle ever so helpfully offered information on the man. Hiroaki Kamen, quirk, gravity, can create a gravitational pull around him and pull things toward him. Sounds fancy but it's actually fairly weak. More of a thug than an actual villain. Personally, I don't like the guy but I do have a contract with him. Dabi is currently my insurance on that front. We got him on the threat of being slowly burnt alive if he broke it. So if he were to escape along with which he wouldn't pose much of a threat to society if he was in Beetle's pocket. Suddenly an idea struck him and he minutely scooted towards Kamen. If you were to hypothetically pull the glass in the windows towards you they would shatter therefore giving us an easy escape route. He whispered so quietly it was almost inaudible. Kamen blinked, obviously surprised at the vigilante who had captured him just minutes earlier was willing to escape with him. Then he realized that the plan would actually work and smiled wickedly. His hand made a small grasping motion and which felt himself be pulled slightly towards the man, and then the sound of shattering glass filled the cruiser and the cops stopped talking and glanced at the now open window that the villain was crawling through. Which moved to follow him but received a kick to the head. Almost received a kick to the head. He had assumed that the man would try and stage some form of betrayal, so he was able to duck. Then the villain had rolled out of the moving vehicle and onto the street. His arm looked broken, and with the absolutely dismal execution of that jump, which didn't doubt it. The cops were staring open-mouthed but were quickly getting over their surprise, so which took the initiative to at that moment shed his HNDCFFS and follow the villain. Although he didn't break his arm in the process, rolling like he did when he got off the train. The police were the only people he actively antagonized and annoyed. He knew it drove Detective Neo Mesa absolutely insane, not being able to keep him in custody for more than 9 minutes. So, wanted to further mess with the authorities, he left a note where he had previously been sitting. The cruiser was pulling over, and if the villain didn't try to leave him for dead, he would have let him escape, but now he had vengeance running in his veins. He pulled out his tranquilizer gun from the folds of his cloak. They really need to check him for weapons better. He aimed at the fleeing villain. He fired one round and he saw Kamin's hand fly to his neck, only to have his body fall down in the middle of the street seconds later. Seeing that his work was done, he broke into a dead sprint and soon lost the police in the maze that was Hosu. He was safely back home when he received a text. 3:12 a.m. Dabbich, someone's at the bar asking for you. Bug boy, be there in 30 less than 3. Dabbich, stop. Bug boy. So he was going to have to be all 3 people in a single night. He had washed out the dye he used for Witch, but Beetle's hair was a bit more complicated to color. It was a faded umber that changed from red to orange to yellow, giving it a fiery appearance. It took a good 15 minutes to get it right and then to place it in Toga's twin buns. He used colored contacts to change his eye color to match his hair and then let Beetle take control. His lips widened into his signature crazed smile before strutting out the door, like a normal person. Witch scoffed. He pulled his hood over his head to hide the extremely noticeable hair as he practically skipped to the bar. Beetle knew he was a giant flirt and probably insane, but he didn't care. He was smart, and that's all that really mattered. He was 2 minutes early when he breezed the bar. He spotted Dabi and Toga making small talk with his client. He glanced at Kurogiri, who immediately started on his favorite drink, a concoction consisting of vodka, white rum, pineapple juice, and about 12 cherries. Everyone else found it disgusting, but Beetle thought it was delicious. He found a seat on Dabi's lap, who immediately pushed him off and then menacingly lit a fire in his hand, daring him to try it again. Beetle stuck his tongue out and then sat on Toga, who made a sound of delight and then started playing with his hair. His possible client watched this all with a slightly amused expression. Kurogiri slid him with his drink, and Beetle began sipping it serenely. Dabi looked disgusted and Toga crinkled her nose. His client cleared his throat, and for the first time, Beetle got a good look at the man. He had wild black curls and dark green eyes that were about 5 shades darker than Izuku's. Beetle suddenly went completely still. He knew this man. He had only seen him in pictures, but he knew without a doubt that the man before him was Hisashi Midoriya. Inko didn't know what had become of her husband, but Beetle, due to his villain connections, knew that his father was a villain vigilante that went by the name of Dragon and was universally feared throughout Japan. But he was never in this part of Japan, so he didn't have to worry about him. For once both Izuku and Witch were silent. Then Beetle composed himself, his too wide grin returned, and insanity once again was lit behind his fiery eyes. What can I help Cha with? Hisashi swallowed. I want information on my wife and son. Beetle's heart actually stopped. I left when my son was born 15 years ago because I had made a lot of enemies and I wanted to keep them safe, but now I want to meet them and explain, and Hisashi rambled. Beetle shut out all personal connection. This was Izuku's problem. This was just another client. I'll help you for a price, of course. What's your dear son and wife's ex-wife's name? He obviously knew that, but he shouldn't know, so he had to play dumb. Inko and Izuku Midoriya. Beetle smiled. Wonderful. I'll track them down for you. Now for payment. Hisashi wasn't stupid enough to reply. How about a favor? What's the favor? The infamous villain inquired. I don't know yet. Just a favor. Equal or less to tracking down your beloved family. A favor from the almighty dragon could be quite valuable. Toga and Dabi stared at the man. They hadn't even realized who it was. Beetle looked them directly in the eyes with a scandalized expression. Did you really not know? Still stunned, both didn't reply. Beetle tooted, I am surrounded by idiots. Toga pouted and Dabi shot him a glare that he returned, looking him directly in the eyes to establish dominance. Only once Dabi backed down did he return to his father. Anyway, do you accept? Hisashi nodded, I do. Beetle clapped his hands and then produced a contract from the pocket of his hoodie. So, just sign here and then we are done. What's the catch? So this is where Izuku got his brain from. Beetle suddenly turned serious and adopted an expression that had made several thugs lose their bladders. If you fail to complete your end of the bargain, this contract will burn right along with your dear family. He pet his head. You see, I have a quirk called Bind. Wonderful for my line of work. It can let me create contracts that when signed, makes sure that whatever the contract entails comes true. He pointed to a bit of fine print at the bottom of the paper. If you look closely you will see that it says, if the signer doesn't complete their end of this bargain, closest family members will burn painfully. A lie, of course. In any other situation it wouldn't be, but he wasn't planning on killing his mother along with himself. He also didn't have a quirk, but they didn't know that and he had never once been questioned if he was bluffing. Plus, if they truly didn't uphold their end then he usually asked Dabi to do what the contract entailed. Hisashi didn't show any sign of weakness, but Beetle saw the slight hint of trepidation in his eyes. Then he blinked and it was gone. Deal. Beetle took another long sip of his drink as Hisashi signed the parchment. We'll be in touch. With that, Hisashi walked out of the bar and Dabi looked at Beetle like he was crazy. Did you just threaten Dragon? Beetle went to pat him on the cheek but was stopped when Dabi caught his wrist and he backed down, pouting. No, I just threatened his family. Are you worried about me, babe? Don't worry, we die like men. IFNG hate you. 3. How the hell did you just say that out loud? Toga giggled, still playing with Beetle's remarkably soft and fluffy hair. Practice, love. And then suddenly, as if she remembered something important, she jumped up. Oh, Beetle-kun. I almost forgot. I got some new eyeliner I wanted to try on you. Dabi groaned, but Beetle smiled brighter than the sun. Shoyuta was having a rotten evening. He had started off with him patrolling Hosu looking for villains. Even though the school had started up again didn't mean that he could slack off. Villains didn't pause for school, so why should he? For once, he was having no luck finding any criminals. At least that was until he spotted a familiar pointed hat and ice blue fishtail braid, the owner of which seemed to be locked in an intense battle with someone he presumed was a villain. The vigilante, which had been a pain in the side for the police for about 4 months. Constantly taunting them, leaving notes, sending pictures, and perhaps the most irritating, never staying in custody for more than 9 minutes. He debated stepping in right there, capturing both the villain and vigilante, erasing both of their quirks, whatever they might be, and turning them over to the police and making sure that they actually stayed in custody. But then he figured, why not let them burn themselves out in this fight and then swoop in when they were tired? So he observed, which moved with almost unmatched speed and switched between weapons almost flawlessly. First, he was defending himself against an onslaught of random objects that the villain seemed to be pulling towards himself, almost hitting which. How can he even see through that fabric around his eyes? There was much controversy about what Witch's quirk was. Some said it was the ability to escape from any situation, and that did certainly fit, but right now Shudo would bet on it being some form of enhanced senses. The villain was quickly running out of materials to throw at the vigilante, and Witch knew it. As soon as he saw an opening, he attacked like a viper, a whip unfurling and wrapping around the villain's legs, pulling him to the ground. In an instant, Witch was above the villain, a gun pointed directly into the throat of the villain. Before the villain could even beg for mercy, they pulled the trigger and a gunshot echoed through the alley where the fight had taken place. Aizawa was concerned that he had actually shot the man until he remembered that Witch never actually hurt the villains and that he carried a tranquilizer gun. The villain had gone still and Shoyuta was preparing to capture the vigilante when the cops, most likely attracted by the gunshot, appeared and promptly handcuffed both Witch and the unconscious villain. They loaded both of them into the back of their cruiser, and by the time they left, the tranquilizer was wearing off the villain, but everything seemed under control. Aizawa could see no easy way that Witch could escape, so he had left it, only to later stumble across those same police officers 7 minutes later and receive the news that Witch had once again escaped and left them a note. The note read, "Dear police, I was debating letting my time run into the double digits, then I got impatient. You really need to teach your officers how to pat down better. I was able to keep all of my weapons except my staff. Hold a seminar." What an absolutely infuriating and cocky child. Aizawa had then stalked off back to the city to look for villains there and try to take out his annoyance at both the police and himself. If only he had followed the cruiser when it left. Maybe Witch wouldn't have gotten away. He was still in a foul mood when he saw a boy in a dark hoodie picking his way through the back alleys of one of the bad parts of town. He briefly wondered what he was doing out at 4:30 in the morning, then he saw a bit of bright orange and yellow hair and paused. A young boy in the bad part of town in the early morning. Fiery hair. There could be other reasons, but there were only so many boys with hair like that. Beetle. Beetle was up there on the scale of annoying and illegal children. He would take Witch over Beetle any day. At least Witch caught villains. Beetle, however, was a villain. An informant of sorts that, based off what the villains they had captured said, had a quirk that made any contract he made come true. He had been attributed to multiple fires since he had made his debut 3 months ago. He was a slippery one, they had never even seen him. Only descriptions. Well, if he was wrong, what's the worst thing that could happen? The underground hero leaped off the roof he had been perched on, capture weapon already wrapped around the boy. He looked surprised, and then once he saw Aizawa, his face broke out into a brilliant smile that reeked of insanity. "Holy crap! You're Eraserhead. I've been captured by Eraserhead," he exclaimed in joy. He pulled back his hood and Aizawa got a good look at the boy, wild orange umber hair that was twisted into 2 buns with matching eyes that were wide with awe and madness. There were a smattering of freckles on his cheeks, and was that eyeliner? His face looked familiar, but Shoyuta couldn't place it. He was sure that he had never seen someone with such vibrant colors, so it was probably just coincidence. "I love you. You're so cool. What do you think of Present Mike? I think you would make a great couple." Shoyuta was taken aback. This kid is definitely insane, and he ships me and Yamada? He couldn't say he was opposed to the idea. What was he thinking? He is talking to a villain who was responsible for arson and some severe injuries and deaths. Come on, Aizawa. Talk to me. I'm your biggest fan. How do you even know I like men? Those words just slipped out and he mentally cursed himself for even talking to the little gremlin. Beetle scoffed. My gaydar had never been wrong and you are making it short-circuit. Was he really that obvious? Getting himself back to track, he pulled out his phone. He was preparing to call Detective Nao Mesa to tell him that he caught Beetle when Beetle's voice suddenly got lucid. I wouldn't do that if I was you. Shuta's gaze snapped to the young villain before asking, why not? Then Beetle's voice reverted back to its tinkling insanity. Well, what are you arresting me for? Arson, murder, assault, he replied immediately. But can you ever prove I ever actually did those things? I mean, you don't even know who I am. I could just be a civilian who wrongfully was mistaken for a villain, he with false innocence. The worst part was that it was true. And even if I was hypothetically, say, Beetle, you can't prove that he is even responsible for those crimes. It might just be one giant coincidence. Maybe a different villain decided to burn down those houses. You can't prove it. The little gremlin was right. With a sigh, he returned his phone to his pocket and prepared to try and get more information out of the villain, but suddenly had to dodge a giant blue fireball. What the hell? He couldn't find the source, but he didn't doubt that it was one of Beetle's villain friends. Eyes scanned the surrounding area. Everything was still shrouded in shadows, so he couldn't see anything other than the still captured informant. At least he thought he was still captured. For the first time, he noticed that the fireball had in fact not missed. It had hit his capture weapon and seared through the fabric, leaving it remarkably easy for Beetle to slip out of, and that was exactly what he had done. The child was nowhere to be seen, and where he had been standing there was nothing but his heap of a capture weapon. So yeah, Shoyuta was having a rotten evening. Izuku saw the exact moment Aizawa opened the email and read the first few sentences. He knew because the underground hero's eyes went wide and he practically threw his phone at the floor. Beetle cackled in the back of his mind, and Izuku tried to hide a smirk as he reviewed the notes he had taken on the class. Everyone's eyes immediately flew to their flustered teacher, and Aizawa tried to save his dignity by clearing his throat, picking up his now cracked phone, shooting a glare at the entire class, and then finally wrapping himself in his sleeping bag as if nothing happened. Beetle had done an amazing job on the fanfiction. It had taken around 2 hours to write, and he had to do the finishing touches on his way to UA. Beetle was a much better writer than both him, so he had to be very careful to not interact with anyone until he switched back to Izuku. Explaining why he had acted verifiably insane would be annoying. Their run-in with Aizawa had been nothing short of hilarious. Beetle and Izuku both had been raving about how furious Eraserhead had been when Dabi had burnt through his capture weapon and Beetle had disappeared. It was only made better knowing that the villain he no doubt was now dead set on capturing was currently sitting not 5 yards away, wrapped in a dark green sleeping bag and figuring out how to help the next generation of heroes become better. It was almost poetic. Fortunately, Izuku had had time to freak out the whole father who was a villain is paying one of your personas to give him information on his child's and wife's whereabouts situation in the few hours afterward while Beetle was writing, and he had come to terms with the fact that whenever Beetle decided to give him the info he would be receiving a visit from dear old dad. Which had been right about that photo of him jumping off the train going viral. The forums were basically exploding, and even the class had been abuzz about his escape from custody. Dude, did you hear that witch escaped from the police again? A boy with hair so red it had to be dyed exclaimed to a kid with an electricity quirk. He showed a video to an amassed crowd that was the entire class with the exception of Todoroki, Bakugo, and Ida. He's so manly. Just look. He jumped off a moving train. Kirishima gestured wildly at his phone that showed a gif of his exit. Do not praise the behavior of vigilantes. Ida reprimanded, although no one paid him any heed. Someone's got a fanboy, Izuku teased, who groaned in exasperation. Why don't I have any fanboys? Beetle pouted in a very toga-like fashion. Izuku could feel which rolling his eyes as he replied, You do have fanboys, you idiot. Entire goddamn web pages on the dark web. But those aren't the same. No one ever praises me in real life. You have an entire class ready to get in your pants. Which, being as unfazed by SXL anything as normal, didn't even have the decency to blush. Beetle, you literally are responsible for over a dozen deaths. I highly doubt that a group of kids in the hero course are going to fanboy over you. Not for the first time in his life, Izuku realized how weird this was. He was literally arguing with himself as two different people. Those two different people had grown to a point where they were sentient, and he had come to regard his body as nothing more than a host for his different personas. Was he a persona? Was he the host? Who was really in control here? Some type of identity disorder? Look who rolled a nat 20 on perception, Beetle purred, his argument with which forgotten. I'm not feeling like right now. More they them. Which and Izuku prayed to whatever forgotten god to give them strength. Normally he respects others' gender identities, but Beetle had at some point decided that they were gender fluid, and that just felt like stepping over a line. Izuku was totally fine with them being sentient and living their best lives with their own personalities and such, but having an entirely different gender was a bit too odd. They were all just different aspects of Izuku after all, and he was very comfortable with his gender as male. You sure we're just different aspects of you, hun? Beetle batted their eyelashes. I think we graduated from there a while ago. This was not how he had wanted to spend his morning, questioning his existence and the voices living in his head. Wow, I'm offended. Just a voice living in your head? Excuse you, this is my head too. A steady headache was beginning to form as Beetle continued to force this existential crisis upon him. We are so much more than just a voice living in your head. We are our own people. Just tethered to a single body. Beetle, will you shut up? He's going to have a panic attack. Which sighed, obviously annoyed at the other persona's blatant lack of consideration. Luckily, the door of the classroom opened and Witch and Beetle shut up as the students hurried back to their seats as a more bedraggled than usual Aizawa shuffled into the class. He narrowed his eyes at the extremely similar dark green bag that Izuku had donned in his honor. He could see why he liked it honestly, it was quite comfortable. He attributed Aizawa's even more erratic appearance to the verifiable horde of reporters that had crowded the doors of the school, latching on to anyone that even got close to the school for a comment about All Might. Eraserhead avoided the media like the plague, so that must have just been a delight for him to deal with. For Izuku it was a delight for sure. The reporters had noted his straight-out-of-garbage appearance, aka lack of uniform, and how he strode towards the school like he owned it, then decided he was too much of an enigma to ignore, and had done their best vulture impression and descended on him like he was carrion. Now, he had months of experience in avoiding the press as Witch, so if he wanted he could have easily disappeared into the crowd, but he was not Witch and did in fact quite like the media. Scratch that, he liked to F with the media. So, when a female reporter had called out, "Excuse me, sir, what exactly is your position at this school and do you have any comment on All Might being a teacher here?" He had stopped and she put a microphone to his mouth while a sea of other reporters crowded her, hoping to catch some of what he said so they could take credit. He noticed some Class 1A students trying to make their way into the school. Some were ignoring the reporters completely, fighting with the reporters, or just straight up trying to get inside the school in one piece through whatever means necessary. Not one of them was actively answering any questions, so the reporters were getting desperate. Perfect. Well, you see here, Miss Vulture. The reporter looked shocked, his nickname for her, but didn't make any move to remove the microphone. I am the school's resident trash mammal and I take care of the students and make sure that none of them talk to any reporters. He saw Ida staring at him in utter betrayal and he couldn't help but smirk. As for All Might, I have no idea who you are talking about and do not recognize that name at all. We do, however, have an All Right. He is our school nurse. Recovery girl died last Tuesday, so we had to improvise. He gave them the most genuine smile as possible. Now, if you would follow me, I had direct orders for Nizu to bring you to his office for a personal interview. The reporters looked shell-shocked as if she couldn't quite decide if this trashy-looking kid was telling the truth or not. Almost in a daze, she followed him to the gate. He knew what would happen if someone unauthorized stepped into school grounds. She obviously did not. With absolutely no hesitation, she stepped over the threshold and the school locked down. She looked at Izuku with scandalized and hurt eyes. You lied to me. Izuku pet his head. The metal doors were coming down fast, and if he wanted to get his last statement in, he would have to do it fast. Did I? I suppose I did. You're right, Recovery Girl died last Wednesday. And with that, the school's defenses locked up the building with a snap, leaving an extremely confused reporter on one side and a positively giddy Izuku on the other. Aizawa was not one for personal grudges. Emotions clouded judgment, so he tried to force himself to not care as much as he could on a daily basis. But Beetle had stepped over a line. He was already irritated at his haughty attitude towards him the previous night, taunting him about Hisashi and then escaping without so much as a trace. And then his phone had buzzed after he announced that they were choosing class rep and he had settled into his sleeping bag that Midoriya had apparently copied. He had opened the unassuming file it contained only to lose his composure when he realized what exactly it was. It was some very, very, very detailed smut about him and Hisashi. His first thought was how whoever sent it had gotten his email. His second thought was who had sent it. The second thought was answered with a small note at the bottom of the 3,000-word link that had, regrettably, been read over 4,000 times. It was that note that had ultimately decided that he would be the one to bring Beetle into custody. Dear Shota Aizawa, T. Eraserhead. I wrote this after our encounter last night. I thought you might like it. Lots of love. Beetle. That insufferable, annoying, cocky, child arsonist would fall by his hand if it was the last thing he did. Tonight, and every night after, he would be hunting, waiting with HNDCFFS and one of his rare smiles. He also wouldn't mind catching Witch while he was at it. There was a much too large population of kids doing illegal things, which had been driving Naomasa insane with his crafty escapes and the fact that he always somehow managed to catch villains they could never quite get their hands on. Speaking of exhausting children, he needed to have words with Midoriya. He arrived at school to a media circus. Abuzz with the news that Recovery Girl had apparently died either last Wednesday or last Tuesday. A reporter nearly in tears about how a homeless boy had made the security walls of the school almost kill her, and how All Might wasn't at the school. So, Midoriya had been having fun with the media. He was secretly jealous that Midoriya could get away with it. Shota had reassured them that Recovery Girl was not dead and unfortunately had to tell them that All Might was actually at the school. That last statement had prompted a barrage of questions about how he was adjusting to life as a teacher that he had left unanswered, along with the just who exactly was that boy then. He had a feeling that telling them that he was Nizu's personal student would not go over well. Ultimately telling the reporters to shoo, which they did not do, he bypassed the security and shuffled into class. He announced that they would be decided. Class rep Ida decided to do it by vote, and Aizawa was planning on taking a nap when he received that infernal message from Beetle. All in all, he was really sick of annoying and sassy children. The class rep thing was entertaining to watch. Predictably, Yaoyorozu got the most votes, shortly followed by Ida. Almost everyone voted for themselves, which was expected. However, there were those few that didn't, and it made a difference. Both agreed to their roles with no resistance, and Aizawa pretended to sleep. Izuku could see that Aizawa was in fact not sleeping. He just had his eyes closed and was probably trying to burn Beetle's writing out of his brain. I love it when what I write affects people," Beetle whispered dreamily. "You traumatized him," which retorted matter-of-factly. "Your point?" Izuku really didn't want to deal with the migraine that was two parts of his brain fighting each other, so he politely asked them to quiet down. "Both of you need to shut your FNG mouths or else you won't have control for a week." They both knew he was bluffing, but they did, mercifully, go silent. He shadowed the class to lunch. He wanted to see how their social dynamics were playing out and if they had any effect on their ability to use their quirk. Lunch Rush also made really good rice. He was shoveling the grains into his mouth contently when a girl with bobbed brown hair and a gravity quirk walked up to him. She smiled at him bashfully. "Hi. I'm Uraraka." He raised an eyebrow. He knew exactly who she was. She had called him out during the first day, plus it was his job to know the students. She scratched that back of her head before looking down at the floor. "I just wanted to apologize for my behavior. You being quirkless shouldn't dictate if you are good enough to help us. From what I can tell, you are more than capable." Well, that was interesting. He searched her eyes for any form of pity but found nothing other than shame and guilt. "It's fine. I knew I would face some resistance, plus you didn't do anything other than agree with Ida and the entire class did that." He tried to make it sound as genuine as possible to placate her concerns. It looked like a weight was lifted from her shoulders, but she still bowed low. "Still, it was my asking you to participate in the test that put you in that situation." He gave her a soft smile. "You were just curious. Never fault yourself for wanted more knowledge." Beetle snickered in the back of his mind. "Why are you sounding so formal?" Which promptly backhanded the villain, to which Izuku was thankful. Uraraka smiled brighter than the sun. "Would you like to join us for lunch?" She gestured to a table where Ida and Azui sat, and even which chimed in to tell him it was a bad idea. "Sorry, I have to talk to Aizawa." Uraraka looked disappointed, although her smile never left her face, and Izuku realized that it would be an A+ poker face. Her unwavering optimism was almost disturbing. That's fine. You're always welcome." Izuku began gathering up his notebooks and preparing to leave. "Thanks. Maybe I'll take you up on your offer sometime." Uraraka waved goodbye before skipping back to her table. "That was weird," Beetle chimed in. Never one to stand for more than a minute of silence. Which sounded so exasperated that he couldn't quite discern exactly what he said, but it sounded like something along the lines of, "Can I GG them?" Izuku would not stop him. Although he didn't technically have to go to the teacher's lounge, he figured it might be beneficial to meet some of the teachers somewhere other than their classes. Opening the door, he seemed to find himself in the midst of an intense argument between Midnight and Ectoplasm. "No. Ida and Uraraka are not compatible," Midnight exclaimed, waving a marker wildly. Behind her was a whiteboard covered in names. Tally marks resided under the names, and it took him a moment to realize that the names were actually ship names. "What the F-? Cementos was watching the scene with a bored expression. Without turning away from his squabbling friends, he answered the question Izuku must have said out loud. Every year Midnight holds a betting pool for which new first-year students are going to be dating by the end of the year. Right now she is doing Class 1A. Beetle was positively tickled and was laughing so hard he was sure that the other teachers could hear. Izuku held a brief press conference with Witch and Beetle before deciding on his ships. I vote Sachako, Momojo, Kiribaku, Tsurokami, and Eraser Mike. Midnight, finally noticing Izuku's existence, spun around and pointed her marker at him. This one. This one is smart. She glared at Ectoplasm. He understands that Sachako is practically canon already. Nizu, who Izuku hadn't noticed sitting next to Cementos, sipped his tea. He isn't wrong. Midnight gave a sound of triumph and put 2 more tally marks under Sachako. She seemed to process the other names Izuku gave and gave him a skeptical look. Kiribaku? Really? Bakugo seems too explosive to ever be in a relationship. That's exactly why Kirishima is perfect. His quirk means he can take Kaken's explosions. Also, Kirishima is the first person here to talk to Kaken and not get exploded. Midnight considered, found his answer satisfactory and put the seconds tally under Kiribaku. Nizu was probably the first tally. She seemed to agree to a degree to Momojaru and Tsurokami, being she didn't ask for an explanation and added the tallies. Then she remembered his last bet, Eraser Mike? That one isn't an option. Izuku shrugged, Class 1A, Class 1 as homeroom teacher. He's got to count. Right. Midnight decided that he was right and wrote, Eraser Mike, with 2 tallies underneath it. 2. Midnight gave him a wicked smile. I've shipped them since we were students here. And you haven't done anything about it? Midnight pointed to a corner of the teacher's lounge. Present Mike seemed to be laughing so hard he was crying and Aizawa looked furious. I haven't needed to. 3 guesses to why Hizashi is losing it. He decided to answer the question truthfully. A villain emailed Aizawa Eraser Mike's smut and he showed it to Yamada. Midnight blinked. Yes, actually. He chucked his phone at the ground his morning. I caught a glimpse. The 18-plus hero snorted. Shota got flustered? I would like to meet this villain and thank them personally. No one's gotten Shota that flustered before. It looks good on him. Beetle did a mock bow inside his head. I think you both might win your bet sooner than expected, Nizu said cryptically. Both Midnight's and Izuku's heads snapped to the principal. What? Nizu continued to sip his tea as he pointed a paw towards the Eraser Mike corner. They looked just in time to see Yamada press a soft kiss onto Aizawa's lips. Aizawa reacted accordingly. His hair stood on end, eyes wide in surprise. The entire staff seemed to freeze, thinking one of 2 thoughts, either what the F, or finally. Yamada pulled away, a slight flush on his features. Aizawa on the other hand, his face was the exact shade of Kirishima's hair. He stood statue still, obviously in shock. Then Midnight broke the silence with a victorious scream. She jumped at Izuku and hugged him. She was gone before Izuku could really process what was happening, flinging herself at Present Mike. Finally! Holy shit! Yes! She shook him like a rag doll. Why didn't you do that before? Aizawa was finally starting to unfreeze and Midnight turned to him with a glare she usually reserved for villains. You better start dating or I will lock you 2 in a closet. Eraserhead sputtered, still trying to wrap his head around what just happened before squeaking out a tiny, of course. Beetle was having a regular party inside his head, overjoyed at his OTP had gotten together over their fanfiction. Izuku was happy too, they were his OTP as well. Although, this was not how he had planned for this to work out. Nizu and Cementos both wore faint smiles. Glad their coworkers had finally admitted their feelings and they wouldn't have to witness to Hizashi's very visible pinning. Izuku took a seat next to Nizu and watched as Midnight practically cartwheeled around the room. Yamada had taken Aizawa's hand and Izuku had half a mind to snap a photo. That half of a mind won and he took a photo. But the wonderful mood of the room plummeted when an alarm overhead sounded and announced, Warning! Level 3 security breach. All students please evacuate the building in an orderly fashion. Every teacher immediately jumped up, reminded Izuku that they were pro-heroes. They could hear the commotion outside the door as students scrambled to leave the building. Someone had managed to get past the school's barriers and they were all panicking. Aizawa and Yamada looked out the window and let out an audible sigh of relief. It's just the press. Nizu set down his tea and transformed himself into the UA principal, Eraserhead, present Mike. You deal with the press. Everyone else help me get the students under control. Everyone in the room simultaneously nodded and hurried to do what they needed. Izuku didn't quite know what to do, so he just sat until Nizu noticed and said, Midoriya, you are an honorary teacher, aren't you? Can you please assist the other teachers in telling the students it isn't a real threat? Izuku hurried out of the room. He realized that which would be much better suited for this situation, so he let him take control. Which found himself back before the lunchroom, at the tail end of a mob of students trying to push their way to the doors. He saw kids being trampled and shoved against the windows. He sighed at how unorganized the students were acting. If this is how heroes are supposed to act, then no wonder vigilantes like him exist. He put his fingers to his mouth and let out the most ear-splitting whistle he could manage. It echoed through the corridor and the students briefly paused their mad scramble and looked to find the source of the sound. The student's closet to the end turned to find a boy no older than a first year with his hands on his hips. Green hair in a messy bun and sunglasses resting on his head. The first thing they noticed that he didn't have on a uniform, so at first they thought he might be the intruder. They readied themselves to fight, but which only rubbed his eyes before screaming as loud as possible, I am Nizu's personal student. He sent me to inform you that there is no threat. It is only the press. The students didn't look convinced, so he added, is this how UA students are supposed to react? You are supposed to remain calm and collected. Did not one of you actually check to see what the threat actually was? The silence of the crowd was enough to tell him that, no, they had not checked. He scoffed as the students started to check the windows and realized that it had only been the press. Soon enough the police arrived and which relinquished control back to Izuku, who snorted and which's exasperation. Beetle still wasn't over the fact that his OTP had gotten together. Naomasa was prepared to start setting wily, coyote traps. The ever-persistent headache that had settled into the base of his skull was quickly turning into a nausea-inducing migraine. 5 run-ins with which this week. To make matters worse, they had caught him 4 out of those 5 times. Had him handcuffed, in the cruiser, heading for the station. They had even gotten him into interrogation once. He tried to suppress his body's involuntary shudder at the memory of that first time he had ever met the boy and actually try to use his quirk and interrogate him. For one thing, his quirk was immediately proved ineffective for 2 reasons. First, the boy was such an amazing liar that it bypassed his quirk entirely. As standard procedure, he had asked his name and what day it was. Friday the 16th, the boy had replied. His quirk detected no lie and the boy had only given him a small smile at his shocked expression. It was Tuesday, the 7th. Secondly, whenever he tried to get even the simplest truths out of the vigilante, his quirk was set off 3 times. What's your name? A simple question. That was phrased so he wouldn't even have to give away his true identity. Which, the boy had monotoned in response without even a second of hesitation. He expected his quirk to count it as a truth, but instead, he got the 3 responses from his quirk: truth, lie, lie. No matter the question, he got 3 responses. He could never be sure which response was correct, so his quirk was now twice as useless. That had never happened before, and try as he might, he couldn't think of any plausible reason other than that which had a quirk that countered his own. He stared into charcoal eyes that glimmered with cold amusement as he refuses to break the detective's stare. It was odd to see the vigilante without the cobalt fabric around his eyes, but he had to admit that it set off his periwinkle hair and made him all the more imposing. It was hard to remember that he was no more than 15. He got the distinct feeling that which was enjoying this little staring contest and that he wouldn't be any more intimidated by the police as he would be a rock. To avoid giving the pain in his butt vigilante the satisfaction, he dropped his gaze, which did not speak unless he asked a question that he replied to immediately with a tone more monotonic than Shota's. The only facial expression that which ever showed other than the slight amusement that he got from confusing Naomesa was a frigid indifference to everything around him. It was infuriating. He acted as if he couldn't even bring himself to care that he was finally in custody. They had confiscated the band he wore around his eyes along with all of his weapons, wooden mage staff, tranquilizer gun, a whip, and a belt of throwing knives he had never seen which use. He had given up trying to get anything out of the vigilante after 15 minutes and elected to call Shota to come and erase the boy's quirk, just in case that was what was interfering with his ability to detect the truth. It wouldn't hurt to have someone else qualified to see if they couldn't get anything else out of the vigilante. Like his name. Shota had agreed and said he was on his way, but when Naomesa walked back into the interrogation room there was no one there. The 2 officers he had assigned to watch the vigilante were on the floor unconscious and there was no sign of the boy. Of course, that didn't make any goddamn sense. They had given him the full package. Quirk repressing cuffs that could cancel any physical quirk, extra normal HNDCFFS, full security coverage, and of course, the officers that were now laying at his feet. At that moment someone from the tech department decided to inform him a few minutes too late that which was making an escape. According to the security footage, which had somehow escaped from both sets of HNDCFFS and then promptly went to attack the 2 officers that were supposed to be watching him. To be fair, the vigilante moved with almost impossible to counter speed and he did get the drop of the officers. From there he strutted out of the room with the haughtiest expression Naomesa had ever seen written all over his features. Now, one would think that they could simply switch to the camera in the hallway and find where he went. He couldn't have gotten far in the 5 minutes Naomesa was out of the room. However, when they switched to that camera they never saw which emerged from the interrogation room. They went over the footage, looking for any loops or jumps in the timestamps but to no avail. At some point in the time, it took which to walk out a doorway he was gone. Naomesa was honest to God ready to start pulling his hair out. He had been giddy, positively giddy. When some of his officers had led in a cuffed and surprisingly docile witch. Maybe he could finally rid himself of the vigilante. That wasn't to undermine the villains which had helped them capture, loath as he was to admit it. It was more that this was a kid. He could be seriously injured or even killed if he continued this occupation. It was for his own good. It definitely didn't have anything to do with Witch's constant taunts and jabs. Naomesa was halfway through the dozens of case files the next day when one of the junior officers set a vase full of periwinkle blue roses on his desk. The detective had raised an eyebrow at the junior officer who rubbed his neck nervously. "What's this?" The junior officer cleared his throat before looking everywhere except Naomesa. They were left just outside the station. "You might want to read the note." Naomesa had a feeling he knew exactly what the note would say, but he read it anyway. "Dearest Naomesa, I just wanted to send this as a congratulations on the achievement that is upping your high score of how long you could keep me in custody. 34 minutes, much more impressive than your old 9. It was wonderful to finally meet you in person and I hope we can do it again. Sincerely yours." The detective sighed and leaned back in his chair. He honestly didn't know what he was expecting, but he was still annoyed. Which must have been directly outside the station and they still hadn't noticed him. The roses were actually quite pretty, a soft blue the exact same shade as Witch's hair. The officer was still standing nervously at the front of his desk and he couldn't help but wonder why. And then he promptly got his answer. Nestled directly in the center of the bouquet was an outlier. It was another rose, but this one was a fiery orange and red. Tied to it with a crimson ribbon was a tiny cream-colored card. It wasn't Witch's and something about the colors set Naomesa on edge. He carefully extracted the orange rose and very slowly turned over the card. Then he read it. And then he read it again. And again. "God damn it," he whispered. "Naomesa-kun, I heard that which got away again. Sorry to hear that, sad face. But you got your time up, so good for you. I was going to give you this rose as congrats, but it looks like someone beat me to it. I hope I can meet you sometime. Zoxo, Beetle." Izuku was seriously considering throwing himself from another building. It wasn't that he wanted to die. It was that Effendi Beach and Weedle wouldn't Effendi shut up. Ever since that run-in with Detective Naomesa and the entire dramatic as F Rose thing, they had been doing nothing but talk. absolutely and positively in hysterics about how they had effed with the police. If he thought them arguing was bad, then this was infinitely worse. Right now he needed to focus on his first ever training session with Class 1A, and he couldn't be distracted by the voices in his head fangirling over that look on Naome's face. He was this close from asking Todoroki to impale him with some of his ice. Speaking of Todoroki, he was the first on his roster for one-on-one training. He still needed to finish the final touches on his plan to hand endeavor his butt, and it was a true masterpiece if he did say so himself. Anyway, based off what he had seen of Todoroki's quirk and how he used it, he totally shunned his fire, and based off what he had seen and heard about the absolute dumpster fire that was Endeavor from Ray, he didn't really blame him. But he did need to get him to accept that part of himself. However, that was for another day. Right now he was going to have him work on intricacies of his ice. Right now it was rough and jagged. It lacked finesse and detail. He hoped that by the time this term was over he would be able to create works of art with his quirk. When he had told Shudo this when they were in the training field for his lesson, he had raised an eyebrow. "And how will that help me?" Izuku screamed internally. The real question was how it didn't help him. Well, for one, it will help you with control. Also, being able to create weapons of ice will help in hand-to-hand combat. That was only scratching the surface, but he really didn't want to explain anymore. He might break down into tears because of Todoroki's ignorance. Shudo nodded, seeming to grasp the concept. "Thank God. How do we start?" "Made a cube." Shudo blinked. "What?" "A perfectly smooth cube of ice. Just big enough to fit in the palm of your hand." Todoroki hesitated but then focused on the task while Izuku lit a cigarette and tried to shut out Witch and Beetle, who were quite literally having a party in his brain. It took 5 minutes for Todoroki to complete the task, and by then he was panting, but in Izuku's book he did better than he expected. Shudo obviously wasn't expecting it to be that difficult and seemed thoroughly disappointed in himself. "That was faster than I expected," Izuku said, hoping to ease Todoroki's displeasure in himself. "Now flatten it." Shudo didn't say a word and set to work making the cube a sheet. 2 hours later, Izuku had a wicked headache and Shudo looked about ready to pass out. Izuku had made him create various simple shapes out of the ice, and Todoroki had made some substantial process. They had ended on the high note of a perfect sphere. A stumbling Todoroki had drawn the attention of the rest of the class from where they were training with each other under Aizawa's watchful eye. A nervous murmur had run through the students because someone had damaged the Titan among them. Izuku didn't miss Aizawa's slight smile at the students' unease. Aizawa had been a lot more smiley lately. He had attributed it to his new relationship with Yamada. He had turned a hallway the other day and had walked into them making out in the corridor. Beetle wouldn't stop screaming for an hour. While Todoroki sluggishly crept into the field to go to spar with Ida, and they immediately pass out, Izuku had given a smile nothing short of terrifying and beckoned for Uraraka to follow him to his secluded training area. He couldn't say that he didn't enjoy her gulp and a worried glance at Ida and Azui. It was 2 a.m. when Izuku got a text from Dabi. He had been having the time of his life laying on his bed and working on some incorrect pro-hero quotes. The secret was that everything he posted had actually been said by one of the pros he worked with at UA. They would have his head if they ever found out, but it was worth it. Anyway, Dabi had texted him with the ever-ominous message, "Dabich, Shigaraki wants to talk to you." Izuku groaned. Shigaraki and Beetle's relationship wasn't the best, and their meetings often ended with Kurogyari having to warp Shigaraki way in an effort to keep him from disintegrating Beetle. Beetle being as antagonistic as possible never helped the situation. But boy, Dabich, business proposition. Now that caught Beetle's attention. The villain had been snoozing in a corner of his mind, and their eyes flew open at the mention of a business deal with Shigaraki, and therefore the League of Villains. This was way not what Izuku wanted to do, so he let Beetle deal with it. Bug Boy, be there in 15. 15 minutes later, Beetle was skipping into Kurogyari's bar, mind racing with all the possibilities. Shigaraki was sitting at the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey and looking for all the world that he would rather be anywhere else. "You look so overjoyed to see me, Tamura-kun," Beetle said, sweeping into the bar stool next to Shigaraki, who growled. Then Beetle abandoned all of their flirtatious insanity, Although madness still gleamed through their orange and yellow irises. Let's make a deal. Shigaraki recognized that Beetle had stopped iffing around. I need information. Beetle snorted. No sheet. On who? Class 1A of UA. Izuku actually started crying with laughter and which snorted. Beetle's lips twitched and it was all he could do to keep from losing it. Should he tell him about his true identity? It really didn't matter, Shigaraki wouldn't rat him out. Having a mole in UA, a teacher especially, would know nothing but assist the league. Then a wonderful idea struck him. Oh, the drama would be spectacular. Sure, what info? Quirks, weaknesses, strengths. Why? Shigaraki sighed, obviously annoyed he had to share his plans. The league is planning an attack on USJ. All Might is supposed to be there and he is apparently weakening. It's the perfect opportunity to kill him. Truth be told, Beetle didn't care what happened to All Might, so he didn't care. Izuku was impartial but which still held the tiniest bit of resentment. He highly doubted that this would go as planned for the league, but as long as he got paid, all would be well. Oh, I know about that little field trip. I'm assuming you want to know where to put the students in the different rescue zones. You know I would much rather not work with you, Beetle, but Sensei insists that we should be prepared. Beetle smiled. Sensei is a wise man. Now, for prices. Shigaraki eyed Beetle apprehensively. You won't kill Eraserhead, Shuto Todoroki, Achiko Uraraka, and Tsuyu Azui. Shigaraki blinked. Who? Class 1, as homeroom teacher and 3 of the students. Shigaraki was still trying to figure out how Beetle knew them already when he asked, why? I quite like Eraserhead and he's part of my OTP who just got together. I have plans that involve Todoroki, and I have a bet to win with Uraraka and Azui. Shigaraki looked simultaneously confused and interested. Fine. Kurogyri will warp them into a secure location until everything is over with. Beetle clapped his hands. Wonderful. As for the other payment. You just got one. Beetle scoffed. Hardly. More, you extract 4 players from the field in less than a minute. What is it? Beetle thought about it. He probably wouldn't get this request, but it was worth a shot. I want a quirk. Shigaraki froze. No. Beetle shrugged. I tried. 1 million yen. 500,000. 6. Deal. And just like that, they shook on it. Beetle was about to become a lot richer and all he had to do was pawn off some info he already had. It wouldn't even take effort. It would be interesting to watch how this played out. Izuku would be participating on the side of the heroes, of course. Although, participating probably meant in this case, looking like he's helping but actually doing nothing. It would be more than fun watching Shigaraki realize that Izuku and Beetle were the same. All in all, today was very productive. Despite contrary belief, Nezu did not know everything. Frankly, he was glad he didn't. Yes, he did have vast reserves of knowledge due to his eidetic memory, and it had come in handy more than once. There was also no denying he was intelligent, more intelligent than most in fact. But there were still things that escaped his roaming mind's thirst for knowledge. He considered this a good thing because to him knowing everything seemed boring. What was the purpose in life if not to learn? Where was the challenge? Where was the fun in knowing and predicting every move of humans? Oh, how he loved humans. So unpredictable and such chaos makers. He loved to observe how they interacted, constantly having to sift through layers of emotions just to respond to a simple question. He loved watching an impulsive decision shift an entire timeline. He loved wondering what would be different if that student hadn't stayed in class a second longer or chose to give a kind word to the quiet student. As a firm believer in the butterfly effect, it was an exercise he did often. So naturally Nezu couldn't help but wonder where Izuku Midoriya would be if he hadn't thrown himself from the roof of his school 11 months ago. He had a feeling it would be so radically different he couldn't even come close to predicting it. Well, he couldn't very well predict Midoriya now anyway. The boy lied as easily as he breathed and had more secrets than All Might that despite Nezu's best efforts he could not unearth. While Midoriya was his personal student, he was also his personal project. The amount of people the boy had under his thumb was admirable enough to put him on Nezu's radar, but it was his relationship with Yagi and Bakugo that had prompted him to take him on. There was also his being quirkless, and to be honest, Nezu had been itching to enroll a quirkless student. Not only was he quirkless, but he was a morally gray quirkless student with ties to a teacher and a student ad. Truly, what more could want? Yagi was practically swimming in his guilt at how he had crushed Midoriya's dreams and, in his words, practically pushed him off the roof himself. Midoriya obviously noticed it but didn't make any attempt to remedy it other than the half-hearted attempt during the first foundational hero studies class. He hadn't been lying about not blaming Yagi and hadn't been any more bitter than expected, but did seem content to let the number one hero stew over it. Nezu would be the first to admit that he had placed Midoriya in 1A to see how he and Bakugo interacted. They obviously had a long and painful history that bordered on abuse. It was ultimately Bakugo's fault that Midoriya had tried to take his own life, and Bakugo was struggling to cope with that. Bakugo was one of the most insecure people he had ever met, and the added weight of knowing he had driven his childhood friend to suicide was surely not helping the situation. He would place money on the fact that Bakugo would break, not shatter outwardly like he seemed so prone to doing, but shatter inside so completely that he would be right beside Midoriya on the suicide roster. Nezu's morals had battled as he was torn between his duty as a principal to make sure his students were emotionally stable, which Bakugo and Midoriya were very obviously not, or his duty as a pursuer of knowledge. Ultimately, his curiosity had won out and he had waited to see how this played out. He wouldn't hesitate to intervene if things went too far, and he would never let Bakugo actually go through with it, but he couldn't deny that this situation made him giddy. Midoriya had surprisingly enough taken to Shudo Todoroki, and if security footage was to be believed, they were plotting Endeavor's downfall for being an abusive BSTRD who is more a villain than a hero. That statement confirmed what Nezu had suspected of NG for years, and Shudo Todoroki's behavior paralleled symptoms of abuse too well to ignore. He had an ongoing file about the Todoroki family, and he had seriously considered opening a formal police investigation but decided to hold off until the boys were done with whatever they were plotting, deciding to observe and see how radically they handled it and how emotions clouded their judgment. He was still trying to untangle the webs of lies that Midoriya had woven around himself, and it was proving to be a much harder task than he had planned, but he joyously accepted the challenge. Midoriya was obviously hiding something, and Nezu was determined to find out what it was. He had caught his personal student muttering under his breath, whispering for things to "shut up" or "you guys are the FNG worst." He never sounded overly upset when he said those things to whoever he was saying it to, more exasperated and endearing. There were also times when Midoriya's demeanor would shift entirely. One moment he was his usual annoying and sassy self, then he would suddenly snap up straight and observe the area with cold eyes that rivaled Nezu's. Or on the completely other end of the spectrum, he would suddenly become quite insane and have a constant flirtatious grin plastered to his face. It intrigued Nezu to no end, even he could not act that realistically, and there was never a set time or reason Midoriya changed. Right now he had some sneaking suspicions, but it was nothing he could prove, unfortunately. Humans were such complex creatures. Shota Aizawa was horrified. Shota had been horrified for many reasons in his life. Whether it be from a villain's actions or his recently gained knowledge of Hisashi's abysmal cooking skills. In his line of work, it was part of the job description. However, right now the source of his horror had nothing to do with him being a pro-hero, although he had been horrified by this person before. With his blatant disrespect for authority and bad habits, Izuka Midoriya had horrified Aizawa more than once. This time, however, it wasn't directly Midoriya that horrified him. It was the fact that he was growing to like the little gremlin. Said gremlin was currently sitting in the seat behind Shota in the bus headed to the USJ and talking his ear off, rambling about the students' quirks and how well they were going to perform in today's tests. With his training, they would apparently do better, which Shota didn't doubt. Problem Child was a bit of a mad genius. Midoriya smelled like cigarettes, and his ever-changing alcohol breath now told Aizawa that he had gone to some sort of wine. The boy had some serious addiction problems, but something told him that if Midoriya didn't want to change, then they shouldn't even bother. He had snapped his sunglasses over his green eyes and had tied his hair into a high ponytail that made him resemble a homeless schoolgirl. He had adopted Aizawa's sleeping bag permanently, and he wore that almost everywhere he went. Underneath would be the absolutely destroyed clothing he never seemed to change out of but at least seemed to wash. And the worst part was that his sass and bad hygiene was starting to grow on the underground hero. He had come to this realization when the boy was halfway through telling him about how he was refining Todoroki's quirk and he had almost crashed the bus into a ditch. He was still in a small form of shock when he pulled into the USJ and the students filed out of the bus and No. 13 gave them their welcoming speech. While the students were still gaping at the inside of the USJ and childishly snickering about its name, he shuffled over to No. 13 with Midoriya at his side. The boy only seemed mildly impressed and despite being inside didn't remove his sunglasses so he couldn't see his eyes, but he knew they were probably bouncing around the facility. He had seen pictures and such so they could prepare for the lesson, but they truly didn't do the USJ justice. He interrupted No. 13's unneeded pose as he realized that Yagi was not present. 3 guesses why not. His suspicion was unfortunately proven right by No. 13's explanation with her helpful model of holding up 3 fingers to illustrate Yagi's time limit. Shota pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed. He was the most irresponsible person this school had ever employed. Midoriya knew that All Might should be here and had met Aizawa's gaze with a deadpan expression that said he shared his sentiments exactly. The boy had somehow figured out Yagi's state all on his own and looked to be just as disappointed in the number 1 hero as Aizawa was. From what he had heard, his and All Might's relationship was strange, but as long as they were able to work together he didn't care. Although it did warm his heart to know that someone agreed with him on how absolutely underqualified Yagi was for a teaching position. The gremlin had already met all of the UA staff and they had all taken quite a liking to the problem child, so No. 13 didn't bat an eyelash and gave Midoriya a ruffled his hair. Midoriya growled with no real menace and Uraraka squeaked and fawned at how adorable it was. Aizawa attributed the other faculty's fondness to the fact that they didn't have to put up with him all day as Shota did. But you like him too, some traitorous part of his mind whispered. Nope. That needed to stop right now. We best get on with it. We are just wasting time, he announced in his usual monotone, giving absolutely no indication he actually had emotions, much less that he was actually fond of someone. Luckily No. 13 took over and gave them a slightly terrifying talk about how their quirks could easily be used to harm. He noted how Shinso avoided looking at anyone as she spoke while she held everyone else's rapt attention. He had put up with years of bullying because he had a supposedly villainous quirk and knew all too well that it could easily be used to harm. 13 bowed and the students cheered. Aizawa was ready to get on with it, but as soon as he pointed towards the USJ proper the lights died and the fountain sputtered. Aizawa felt the shift in the air and spun around just in time to see a regular void being ripped open in the main plaza of the USJ. Once birthed into existence, the portal cracked and expanded in size until it took up the entire courtyard. Smoky yellow eyes glared at them from the top of the void and Aizawa snapped in hero mode. Within moments of the appearance of the portal appearing, it was pulled apart like a curtain by a man with ragged hair so light of a blue it was almost white that seemed to be wearing disembodied hands on his arms and face like they were accessories. No one move. Stay together. Shota shouted at his students, instinct taking over. Midoriya and 13 stay and protect the students. The students had taken notice of the vortex and were on high alert as the man covered in hands was shortly followed by villains armed with various weapons. Within moments the entire courtyard was completely full of enemies. The only one that truly concerned him was the behemoth of a man with one hell of a mutation quirk. He was an unnatural shade of purple and had eyes were sticking straight out of an exposed brain and rows of jagged teeth. There was a predatory glint in his eyes that makes Shota wonder if he was even human. He immediately slipped into his hero mode along with No. 13. Midoriya shifted as well, posture straightening as his eyes darkened with cold calculation that he had only ever seen on Netsu. He was suddenly reminded that this boy was also smart enough to keep up with the principal and not be intimidated by him. He strapped on his goggles, mind racing. Right now the students were the first priority and he had to make sure they got to safety. The students didn't seem to know what was happening. Kirishima even inquired if this was part of the simulation. He was about to fill them in when Midoriya beat him to it. No, Kirishima, this was not planned. Those are villains, and at the moment our top priority is to keep you safe, so I'm going to ask you to run and get out of here immediately to alert the school. The class all gasped as their eyes flew wide with fright. Uraraka looked terrified but was able to squawk. But what about you? You have to come with us. You don't have a quirk and nearly enough power to take on all of them. Aizawa felt compelled to agree but didn't have the opportunity to speak before Midoriya turned to Kaminari, completely ignoring Uraraka. Try to use your quirk to alert the school. The villains probably cut off all communication, so you're your best bet. It was becoming more apparent that this was a well-coordinated attack. They had cut off all communication and had very carefully chosen an isolated location to strike at an exact time a class would be present. They may be stupid for trespassing onto UA, but they did have a goal in mind. Shota was surprised how well Midoriya was handling this, taking control of the situation immediately and not even showing the slightest bit of panic. But that didn't excuse the fact that he physically couldn't take on the villains without a quirk. He needed to leave with the rest of the students. Midoriya, go with the other students. You and 13 make sure they get to safety and alert the school. Aizawa commanded, stepping forward to engage the villain group, capture weapon already starting to float around him. Midoriya offered no response and instead stood stock still. He had removed his sunglasses to accommodate for the lower light level and his emerald eyes were bouncing from villain to villain. Taking that as confirmation, he nodded at 13, who nodded back, and he jumped down into the plaza, wind whipping through his hair as his mind blocked out everything other than the fight. He activated his quirk on the first trio of villains and used his capture weapon to smash them together, leaving them in a heap on the floor. Soon he was surrounded and had obviously been recognized. A heteromorphic villain flew at him, saying how he couldn't erase his quirk, which was true enough. He ducked under the villain's fists and landed a solid hit to his face, knocking him into the air as he ducked the fist of another villain behind him. Letting his capture weapon wrap around the heteromorphic villain as he kicked the villain at his back, knocking him along with two others to the ground. Pulling his capture weapon, he let the huge body of the heteromorphic villain crash into their amassed pile. There were brief moments of standstill when the villains decided how to attack, but he quickly ended those moments with a few kicks to the face. He had been so wrapped up into battle, he didn't notice Midoriya had run down the stairs to join him until the boy was engaging the villains at the edge of the circle. Midoriya was moving like lightning, hitting pressure points that rendered the villains useless. There was a glint in his eyes that spoke of calculated attacks and total destruction, although his expression was totally neutral. The boy was slowly clearing a direct path to the hand villain, and it was all Aizawa could do to call out to him, "Midoriya, get back to the other students." Midoriya didn't offer any reaction as he picked his way across the field with nothing but his fists and feet with such brutal efficacy that Aizawa mentally kicked himself for underestimating him. In that brief moment of silent observation and revelation, Aizawa lost focus and received a punch to his stomach that left him gasping for breath. Suddenly he felt himself falling. He looked to find the warp villains standing behind him as he fell into the warp gate that he had summoned on the floor. The last thing Shota Aizawa saw before he fell through the gate entirely was Midoriya standing before the apparent leader of this attack. He saw the green-haired boy say something and a look of absolute confusion and outrage pass over the hand villain's face, which was annoyed. Why was he the one that had to do all of the physical fighting and assess the situation? He was strictly in the neutral. This was Izuku and Beetle's ploy. But here he was, picking his way across the ocean of thugs without his weapons and bruising his knuckles while he ignored Aizawa's shouts for him to retreat and 13 and Class 1A screaming at him to come back. All of them too stupid to realize that it wasn't Izuku and instead the vigilante they had been fawning over just days prior. First of all, those are technically all of our knuckles you are bruising. Second, you are the best at physical fights with quirks like this, so take it as a compliment. And third, ouch, I happen to like some of the people in that class. Izuku said in his mind, ticking off the points on his fingers. Plus we can't disguise madness very well and Azarin would probably notice if it was me. Beetle ever so helpfully pointed out. Izuku turned to Beetle, are you sure you should be so proud you're crazy? Beetle pressed a hand over his heart as if he had been wounded. How dare you, Izun? I thought we were friends, TT. For the 100th time, how do you use emoticons in SPECH? Can you two shut up and actually help me? I'm trying to keep us from getting killed. Which murmured under his breath, ducking a villain's punch as he caught the villain's arm and twisted it, breaking the bone in two. He was close to Shigaraki, and once he reached Beetle's employer he could retreat to sulk. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Kurogiri warp behind Aizawa and create a warp gate. At least they were keeping their part of the deal. With a few more well-placed attacks, the remaining villains separating Witch and Shigaraki fell to the floor, and Witch let Beetle deal with it. Shigaraki looked momentarily surprised that someone had gotten past all of the villains and looked even more confused when Beetle waved at him. Hiya, Tamura-kun. Fancy seeing you here. Then Tamura recognized the mad glint in Beetle's now green eyes and the flirtatious smirk that drove him so insane. His expression shifted somewhere between absolute rage and confusion, and oh my god, how Beetle wished he had a camera to immortalize that face. Beetle? He asked almost hesitantly. Beetle smiled wider, positively giddy at his grand debut. In the flesh. What are you doing here? Tamura squawked, still trying to figure everything out. Well, I work here, silly. Well, technically Izuku works here, but that is basically the same thing. Beetle giggled despite Izuku and Beetle screaming at him not to. Tamura grew suddenly furious. So you're a hero then? None of us are heroes. I mean, we have Izuku who is here because he's Nedzu's personal student. But only because he was bored, and which being a vigilante and being insanely salty about the world. Then we have me who had burnt down way too many buildings to ever be considered a hero. Why the f did you say that? Witch and Izuku shouted in unison, positively outraged that Beetle had given away their secret. Wait, Witch is a student here too? Tamura growled, trying desperately to piece everything together. Beetle sighed. I think it would be better if I showed you. Suddenly he pushed Witch into command, and the madness faded out his eyes and his face became the schooled into the cold mask he always wore. Goddamn it, Beetle. It is your problem, not mine. Deal with it. And then Beetle was back with his signature insanity. Shigaraki was left blinking in shock as he stuttered, What the hell? Is it some sort of quirk or? Beetle shrugged. Nope. We are all as quirkless as it gets. Probably some sort of personality disorder. You told me I wasn't a personality disorder. Izuku screamed inside his head, but Beetle shushed him as he continued his conversation with a stunned Shigaraki. It's truly amazing what hair dye and colored contacts can do. I trust you won't give away any of our secrets, Tamura-kun. Having a mole in the school is much too valuable for that. Beetle joyously exclaimed, having way too much fun messing with Tamura. Tamura was still reeling but nodded. Wonderful. I trust Kurogiri has gotten the ones I want alive to safety? Shigaraki was snapped out of his daze by the sharp threat hidden behind Beetle's words. Probably. Kurogiri knows what he's doing and he never does back on a deal. So true. Now if you could please look like you're fighting me. It's important to keep up appearances, you know. Tamura wasn't particularly in the mood for a fake fight, having realized how thoroughly Beetle had been deceiving him all this time. So naturally, like the child he was, he flew at Beetle with every intention to serious hurt him. Beetle just sighed and forced to set off Witch back in control. Luckily, Witch was too busy staying alive to complain. Aizawa was not someone who was quick to anger. In fact, it was a near impossible feat. Sure, he was bitter and tired all the time but never actually furious. But here he was. Fing said. When he had said earlier that he would catch Beetle no matter what, he had meant every word. He was planning on doing everything in his power to bring that tiny and insane villain into custody. So what, he had finally gotten him with the guy he had been crushing on since high school? He hadn't been joking, but it was more of a side project. At least that was until the little orange-haired arsonist got him warped into a tiny metal box. Away from the battle. Away from his students. Away from Fing Midoriya. He had very unceremoniously been dumped into a 10 by 10 room with walls covered in steel with a single goddamn electric lantern hanging from the ceiling. It was bright enough that its tendrils of artificial light reached every corner, showing him that there was no way out other than a door like you would use in a bank vault. He had obviously tried the door and had very thoroughly locked. There was also a note. Because why wouldn't there be? 3 guesses who it was from. Dear Shota, or whoever gets here first. Hiya. I had ever so graciously made a deal that got you, yes you, transported out of the impending battle and into safety. I can't have one of the people in my OTP die so soon. Talking to you Shota. I have to win a bet to win for 2 of you, that's Yutsu and Ochako. And the last one is just too fun to kill off so soon. Process of elimination leaves Shoto Owo. Don't worry, you'll be freed once this pointless battle is over. Anyway, I'm not the best at physical fights so I'm sitting this one out. But don't worry. I'm sure I'll meet everyone soon, love. Hugs and kisses. Beetle. That note left Aizawa with many important questions that he would very much like answered. First off, how exactly did Beetle even know half the stuff he had casually mentioned? Like Shota's new relationship and Ajui's preferred nickname and who Ajui and Uraraka were in the first place. A bet placed on them was more than concerning and Todoroki's explanation wasn't even an explanation. It was some small consolation knowing that at least 3 of his students would be safe. He had a feeling they would be joining him shortly. Beetle didn't seem like the one who would let someone get away without holding their end of a deal. Actually, he knew Beetle wouldn't let someone break a contract. His quirk prevented it entirely. Alright, he needed to think about this rationally. He took a few calming breaths, trying to clear his head so he could dissect the situation. Beetle made a deal with the villains leading this attack, that much was obvious. What the villains wanted from him was still a mystery and Shota knew he got safety for Ajui, Uraraka, Todoroki, and himself in return. In the grand scheme of it he highly doubted that their lives were all he got in return but he didn't know what else he could have received. The note told him that Beetle had some sort of connection in the school, only the faculty knew about him and Hizashi. There could be a variety of mediums but all of them spelled doom. They needed to sniff out how he knew all of that in the first place and destroy his medium immediately. The bet with Ajui and Uraraka could mean anything and Beetle wasn't telling the entire truth about why Todoroki had been spared. Now to the entire USJ attack as a whole. The villains were organized and this was premeditated on heavily. They must have a concrete goal in mind that they were dead set on achieving. His students were in serious danger and he couldn't do anything about it. No Aizawa calm. Panic later. Midoriya had for some reason charged the main villain and had done something to shock him. Aizawa briefly noted how he had somehow gotten past the ocean of villains before he did and couldn't help but be impressed. Although Midoriya was now in the most danger, facing the main perpetrators head-on without backup. He had probably been relying on Shota to lend him that backup but now that he wasn't there, whatever plan Midoriya had was probably gone and he was winging it. Suddenly Aizawa was ripped from his train of thought by the tumble of bodies and he saw Uraraka, Ajui, and Todoroki be dropped from a warp gate in the ceiling. He wasn't sure if he should be relieved or annoyed. Uraraka looked confused but that confusion swiftly morphed into rage. Todoroki looked about as furious as Aizawa felt and Ajui was calmly taking in the situation. What the hell just happened? Uraraka screamed, stalking over to Aizawa with tears in her eyes. If any of them were even remotely surprised to find their teacher in the same position, none of them showed it. Opting to examine the door like Todoroki, reading the note like Ajui, or just demanding answers like Uraraka. Can you tell us why we were forcefully removed from the fight? Our friends are in trouble. Deku-sensei is facing the villains alone. 13 is... Uraraka started hyperventilating as the panic finally set in over the fury. Dimly Aizawa wondered when Uraraka had started calling Midoriya Deku-sensei. In an instant Ajui was at her side, soothingly rubbing her back in an effort to stave the well-deserved panic attack. Taking this as his cue to offer what little explanation he could offer, Aizawa opened his mouth to speak with an irritated sigh. The only information I have is from that infernal note that Ajui just had. The only thing that told us is that the villain and informant Beetle was responsible for our removal and if he is to be believed, which we aren't sure if he is or not, will be released. Todoroki looked up from where he had been inspecting the only exit. Any particular reason he chose us to save? Shota sighed and rubbed his forehead. Nothing to really help us. His reasoning is cryptic at best. Ajui croaked from where she was contenting to comfort Uraraka. The note said something about Aizawa-sensei being part of his, a bet with me and Uraraka-chan, and that you were just too fun to kill off so soon. Todoroki raised an eyebrow at Aizawa and he scowled at the acknowledgement. The boy is mad. I have had the absolute pleasure of meeting him, and if there is one word to describe him it would be insane. Having finally composed herself, Uraraka hiccuped, "Boy?" Shota realized that Beetle was a much lesser no-villain to anyone other than a pro-hero or say a son of a pro-hero. He can't be much older than you. Although that doesn't make him any less dangerous. He may be insane, but he also is smart with vast reserves of blackmail and information if this attack was anything to go by. On his official record he has over 15 cases of arson and 11 charges for murder, not including of course the countless people he's injured and the cases we can't prove as him. Uraraka swallowed, taken aback by the large criminal record on the teenager. But you said he was an informant? Why had he killed so many people? This time it was Todoroki that answered, it's part of his quirk. It allows him to make contracts with people, and if they don't uphold their end the consequences written into the contract will come true. He is quite fond of setting the terms as, this contract burns and so do you or your loved ones. Uraraka looked stricken, although Azui only looked down at the floor sadly. That's horrible. Why should innocents suffer if they don't uphold their end? Todoroki left his post at the doorway and stalked over to where the note had been left, no doubt wanting to read it for himself. Think about it from a villain's point of view. What's something even more compelling than their own lives? If he wants to keep them in check, it really is one of the most direct routes to ensure their cooperation. Todoroki's frown deepened as he read Beetle's note before continuing. By organized villain standards, Beetle is fairly mild in terms of identifiable crimes. However, the thing that makes him so dangerous is that we have no idea where he gets his information and how much information he has. It's fairly obvious that he offered information on the USJ, and the fact that he knows of our specific names, especially Azui's nickname, is more than worrying. Aizawa nodded in agreement, even if he was slightly irked that Todoroki was only deepening Uraraka's fear, but everything he was saying was true. Shota suddenly remembered that Uraraka had said something about the current state of the class and he desperately needed an update. Uraraka, you said something about how everyone was faring? Is everyone alright? Uraraka blinked hard as if to dispel tears she refused to let fall. No. 13 used their quirk on the warp villain and he turned it on them. Aizawa blinked, not letting any nerves break through his facade. His students were already worried enough. You mean 13 turned themselves to dust? Azui took over from Uraraka, who was starting to look overwhelmed. Not entirely, only their back. As for the rest of the class, they were presumably warped into the different zones in the USJ, so we don't know of their current state. Karo. Understandable enough. A decent plan, divide the students so they could be easily killed if the note was any indication. And Midoriya? He was almost afraid to ask about the gremlin child he had grown to care about. Last time we saw he was still engaged with the villain with the hands. He got hit a few times, although I couldn't see how bad from the distance. There was a few bloody patches that we could see, but once again how bad I don't know. Not good. I really didn't matter how physically strong Midoriya was, he couldn't hold out forever against someone with a quirk. It was a small relief to find that he wasn't already dead, but he certainly would be after long. We need to get out of here, alert the other heroes. Whatever was blocking communications in the USJ is still affecting us here, so we can't be far unless it's a device and not a quirk. Can you melt the door or freeze the lock, Todoroki? Todoroki shook his head. Already tried, some special metal that is extremely heat and cold resistant. They were prepared. Aizawa's mood somehow got worse. The only concrete idea he had was gone. That was at least until Uraraka sniffled, drawing the attention back to her as a familiar fire overtook her eyes. I think I might be able to help. Shota raised an eyebrow but didn't stop her as she shuffled over to the door. She closed her eyes as she placed both palms flat on the metal surface. Deku-sensei has been helping me with levitating smaller specific parts of objects. It still takes a lot of concentration and doesn't always work. But, if this is the locking mechanism that I think it is. For a few moments she didn't speak, the tension in the room was palpable. If this worked, he would have just another thing to thank Problem Child for. Then there was a resounding click and the door popped open. Uraraka turned back to them with a smile nothing short of wicked, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw Azui blush. Todoroki pet his head. How did you do that? Uraraka flinched under the intensity of his gaze but didn't pause for more than a moment. It was a simple safe lock. Totally inaccessible from this side, but if I can feel the door I can individually target the specific rings inside the lock, and using my quirk I can make them spin until I feel the slight hitch when I hit the right area. Azui piped up from behind Aizawa. Wow, Uraraka-chan, that's pretty impressive. I didn't know you had that type of sensitivity from your quirk. Now it was Uraraka's turn to blush. I don't. I have to constantly float and release until I get it just right. It's time-consuming and makes me nauseous, but I'm still learning. Aizawa cleared his throat. Maybe Nemuri had been right about those too. Thank you for getting the door open, Uraraka. We don't know where we are yet or if there are any villains waiting for us, so we have to be careful. Everyone get behind me. They did so without too much reluctance, although Todoroki scowled. He could get over it. As silently as possible they shuffled out of their cell. From what he could tell it was in the basement of an abandoned building. They peeked around every corner but found not another living soul other than a few spiders that while Todoroki flinched at the webs the girls swatted them away without hesitation. Before long they were outside in a barely monitored part of town. Shota checked his communication device, being pleasantly surprised that it was now functional. He called the school immediately to inform them of the development but was even more pleased to hear that they were already on it. Ida had apparently escaped and had run into All Might, who was on his way to the USJ. He couldn't stop the relief that flooded him when Nedzu informed him that there had been no deaths. Any significant injuries? The pause on the other end was not reassuring and his blood went cold. Only 13 and Midoriya have anything serious. 13 having gotten their quirk reversed back on them and Midoriya with disintegrated parts of his body and broken bones. Trauma to the face from when the purple monster smashed them into the ground. Aizawa stopped breathing for a moment. Midoriya had gotten seriously hurt. An unfamiliar rage at Beetle soon bubbled up under his skin. It was as much Beetle's fault Midoriya was injured as Shota's. He was going to bring that child to justice and make him pay. Before it had been a promise. Now it was an oath. Izuku was in pain. It wasn't unfamiliar, and with all the pain meds Recovery Girl had him on now it was more of an annoyance than anything. But Jesus, he knew Shigaraki would be said but not said enough to sick the FNG Nomu on him. He could have died. I want you to shut up. You didn't even do any of the work. Which grumbled in his mind, upset he wasn't getting any credit but equally too tired to care. Well, I'm the one having to deal with the consequences of your failure because you pushed me back into control once the Nomu got us. Izuku quipped right back. I wonder how said Shota is right about now. If he wasn't already dead set on me then this definitely set a price on my head. Beetle laughed, derailing the impending argument. You said I didn't have a personality disorder. Izuku was being increasingly frustrated with his alters, but he couldn't deny the fact that he had already considered the possibility and was just unwilling to accept it. Did you honestly think this was normal? Which replied with lazy eyes, being thoroughly exhausting from all the fighting he had done. Also, don't lie to yourself, sweetie. You had already come to terms with it a long time ago. Beetle batted innocent eyelashes. God, Izuku hated it when they were right. Does that mean I can just spontaneously create new alters? Which said at the same time Beetle said, yep. He could feel the staring contest they were holding. No, that isn't how it works. Which apparently won the dominance battle. Do I have other alters or is it just you two? Izuku asked, not expecting any answer other than no. Instead, he was met with silence. Do I have alters other than you two? Now Izuku was brimming with something between excitement and apprehension. Maybe? Beetle replied after a few seconds of silence. Poor they. I want to meet them. Which was the first to shut it down. No. I refuse to be the only somewhat sane person here. Plus, you may not like who this one resembles. Now Izuku was definitely curious. I want to meet them. I deserve to know who they are. Which we have too. I happen to not entirely hate them. They aren't exactly like him. He's gotten better. Beetle pleaded. which said nothing for another few minutes before issuing a small fine. Beetle clapped his hands and suddenly Izuku felt another presence in his brain. He was now slightly nervous and cautiously peered not his mind to locate the new altar. The first thing he noticed was shockingly neon pink hair parted to the side. What was with them all collectively deciding not to have normal hair colors? Then again his hair was green. The second thing he noticed was the bloodlust shining in eyes bluer than a mountain lake. Crystal clear, they did nothing to hide the sheer rage hiding behind the irises. Izuku subconsciously flinched. He had only ever seen rage like that in the eyes of Kaken right before he was beaten to a pulp. Now he could see what Witch was talking about. The new addition was giving off a distinctive Kaken-like vibe. However, instead of it being directed at Izuku, Witch, or Beetle, it seemed its recipient was Kaken specifically. While the others all held some sort of bitterness, they had never even come close to the righteous fury contained within the tiny new altar. His smile was sharp enough to cut, and it reeked of vengeance. For some reason, there was an all-might baseball bat hanging off his shoulder and crimson-stained lips smacking as he chewed pink bubblegum that Izuku begrudgingly approved of. Eyeliner sharp enough to skin a man accented those terrifyingly saturated blue eyes in a look that really matched the altar's aesthetic. His aesthetic was made obvious by the ripped flannel around his waist, the distressed jeans, and the wrinkled white shirt with stains that looked suspiciously like blood. And of course the black Vans. While Witch looked like he was straight from a video game, Beetle dressing like an actual normal person, and Izuku's style of straight from the trash, the new zombie apocalypse thing fit in surprisingly well. Finally. Took you long enough, Beetle dear, the new altar purred. Witch sighed, resigning himself to being a babysitter of 3 instead of 2. While the new altar and Beetle gossiped and laughed, Witch took the initiative to formally introduce Izuku. This is Cypress. He sighed with the power of 100 Aizawas. Witch darling. Thanks for letting me finally join you. Cypress broke off his conversation with Beetle and skipped over to the increasingly tired vigilante, twirling the bat. Now Izuku was getting some mixed signals. While Cypress looked badass and radiated enough pure rage to make even Kaken shiver, his way of talking and mannerisms were throwing Izuku for a loop. Then Izuku accepted it because honestly, that was the least strange part of this entire exchange. Hey Izuku. I'm Cypress. You got pretty effed up back there. Cypress laughed and raised a hot pink eyebrow. I would tell you I'd help you F them up, but they already got blasted out of the arena. Izuku chuckled, and which looked like he was going to jump off a bridge. He wasn't kidding when he said he was now the only sane one out of the 4 of them. Izuku almost felt sorry for the vigilante. Then he remembered that he had forced Izuku to deal with the Nomu, and that pity was quickly squashed. Anyway, I'm sure we'll get a chance to know each other, but right now you got a Dadzawa to deal with, hun. Beetle started screeching at Dadzawa, and sure enough, a very said Shota Aizawa shuffled into the infirmary. It was kinda hard to see him through the bandages covering his entire beautiful freckled face. His broken arms and partially disintegrated torso were also bandaged to the point where he couldn't move, so there was that. Fun times all around. Katsuki lived a life consisting entirely of rage and regret. The speeds of ire were as familiar to him as his quirk. Anger was like paprika, barely even noticeable amid the other tastes of life. Seething fury more of cayenne powder, embracive heat that left your mouth dry and a chapped smile on your lips. But when he saw Deku, useless anger rushed the villains, an indescribable rage so intense and passionate, he had nearly choked when it had overtaken his mind. His vision was always tinted red, but here he couldn't see anything past the wave of crimson. Everything was moving too fast. One moment that nerd was herding them towards the door, pretending to be so superior because he was Nedzu's personal student. Katsuki had turned snarl at the pretentious Bigi who had at gall to boss them around. Then just like that he was gone, shooting down the stairs at a speed that Katsuki had thought impossible without assistance from a quirk. And Katsuki had literally exploded. Was this what it felt like to watch your world shatter? Because for once every ounce of Katsuki's anger was directed to someone he never thought it would touch, Katsuki himself. For years he bullied Izuku relentlessly. taunted and tormented him for his lack of a quirk. Broken both his body and his spirit, reveled in it. Tore into his self-esteem like it was a meal to enjoy. His own personal punching bag for when he needed a confidence boost. Had manipulated and effed with his head just for sheets and giggles. Since he was 4, it had been his unequivocal goal to make Izuku Midoriya's life hell on earth. The worst part was that he had succeeded. He had single-handedly pushed Deku over the edge. Literally. While Deku might have just been isolated on his own because of his quirklessness, it had been all Katsuki that had raised the entire FNG school against him. Even gotten the teachers on his side too. Had arranged the festering hatred against the boy, his only crime being his genetics. Katsuki would never forget getting the call. The old hag had been yelling at him to do his homework when the phone rang. Mitsuki had answered it only to find a sobbing Inko, babbling about how a roof and a hospital and suicide. Mitsuki suicide. For once the Bakuga household was silent. But words had echoed all too clearly through Katsuki's mind, go jump of the roof then beach. Maybe you'll get a quirk in your next life. He had finally made Izuku snap, and it was only thanks to whatever merciful gods he hadn't actually died. Thank God it never got out it was Katsuki's fault. Thank God Deku had transformed himself out of the meek boy who had accepted all of Katsuki's abuse and still revered him. And right then that boy who had once been Deku charged into the heart of the villains. Not pausing his dance of destruction as he pirouetted and traded blows with villains much older than him with much more firepower. He pushed through them all. Not stopping for breath or reprieve, plowing down evil with more ease and grace than Aizawa. Unhearing or uncaring to Aizawa's pleas for him to return to the group and 13 and some of the other extras' shouts for him to come back. And in that moment Katsuki realized something through his haze of fury. Deku had never been useless. Katsuki had. The invasion had turned out with the best possible outcome honestly. With only injuries to one staff member and an unofficial student that the media was unaware of, they couldn't leech off this story and threaten the school. If they were lucky, they might be able to keep this from being blown out of proportion by the impending media circus. From what he gathered, this had been a much premeditated attack. Complete with exact coordinates and the weaknesses of the students. Rio had swept the entire campus 3 times over, checking anything suspicious, but had turned up empty-handed. Higuri running enough tests looking for bugs and such, it had nearly frozen the system. Still nothing. However Beetle had attained the info would remain a mystery. That left only 2 plausible conclusions. The villains had used the brief time the press that managed to breach UA walls to gain all the necessary files, or there was a mole. Nedzu sincerely hoped it was the former. It made more sense logically, but it was still an awfully short PRD of time to achieve all of this information. It was due to that small sliver of possibility he hadn't ruled out the idea of a spy. Loath as he was to admit it, Nedzu's mind had immediately jumped to Midoriya. Around the same age as Beetle if Shuda's statement was to be believed. The boy had enough intelligence along with motivation to be the infamous informant, but there was still the matter of Midoriya being one of the 2 people seriously injured. As cold-hearted as villains were, they normally didn't actively seek to harm their own. This of course could be a logical ruse on the villain's part, hoping the principal would believe since Midoriya had been harmed it wasn't their devious informant. Then again, they wouldn't want Beetle dead, and it was a well-stated fact that if Toshinori hadn't shown up when he did, Midoriya would be 6 feet under at the moment. He had to stop this. He would only drive himself mad. Throwing reverse psychology back and forth would get him nowhere. It was a game he could play all day and he would still be no closer to the truth. The villains also hadn't accounted for the newly acquired abilities of the students thanks to Midoriya, and if he was Beetle, those would have most certainly added those factors into equation. By the end of his thought process, Nedzu was quite sure that Midoriya Izuku was not Beetle, and in a moment of rare fondness scolded himself for ever thinking so. Aizawa still looked mildly furious. At who Izuku couldn't tell. Probably everyone. Don't think he hadn't noticed how the underground hero had started to warm up to him over the last few weeks. He was on enough painkillers, he was a little loopy. Well, more loopy than normal. Sup, Dad's, I meant Aizawa, he finished off in a hurry, realizing he had started to use Cypress's nickname for the older teacher. Cypress snickered, which didn't dare shut him up. Aizawa blinked twice, being smart enough to realize the back half of the nickname, before ultimately forgetting about it. How you doing, you brat? You kinda deserve it, being you decided to directly defy my orders and get yourself. He trailed off, gesturing at Izuku's mummified body. Against his better judgment, a 1:4 ratio now, he replied with the most cliché and annoying response possible, "You aren't my mom." Aizawa huffed and raised an eyebrow. "Would you like us to call her?" Izuku's eyes flew wide in panic. His alters have all simultaneously frozen as well. That isn't necessary. They were all having flashbacks to times when they had done something reckless and Inko had found out. The ensuing results were not pretty. They were always somewhere between Inko scolding his ear off and her being reduced to a sobbing heap. Neither were fun separately, and together, it was more accurate to call it torture. Delighting in the expressive response from the teenage Aizawa's lips twitched upward. "Too late, we already did." At 2. Being you got attacked and all. Which had presumably hit one of the emergency use only buttons in his brain, being it was completely shutting down. Cypress was trying to find a way back to a time when he hadn't been in Izuku's conscious. Beetle was sobbing on the floor, which was trying to keep it together and failing miserably. Izuku only sighed and leaned back, his head hitting the pillows with a soft "oh." At this, Aizawa actually laughed. It came as so much of a shock it galvanized Izuku back to life. "Sorry, kid. Just it was too funny to think that the mighty Izuku Midoriya, who literally just got nearly killed, is terrified of his mother." Aizawa cackled again and Izuku frowned. "Just wait until you meet her," he ground out through clenched teeth. "Still, what were you thinking?" Aizawa snarled, apparently remembering that he wasn't here to tease Izuku about his mom. Izuku needed to make up a lie, and quick. He couldn't very well say, "Oh, you see, I am also the villain Beetle, and therefore knew that you Todoroki, Azui, and Uraraka would be taken from the fight, and I wanted them to stand somewhat of a chance. Also, I wanted to see the look on Tamura's face when I told him that I was Beetle." Izuku rubbed the back of his neck with bandaged hands. I knew I could help you, and you wouldn't be able to keep off that many villains. You're better at one-on-one fights, not large groups." Aizawa narrowed his eyes. "You can't be a hero if you only have on trick. Still, you couldn't have made it through the entirety of the battle unharmed," Izuku said, slipping into the analytical mode of his youth, remembering all the notes he had taken on Eraserhead as a child. Aizawa recognized he spoke the truth and didn't disagree, but he still said, "So you decided to get beaten to a pulp by a purple monster? To help me?" Izuku winced. "Look, I didn't intentionally try to get beaten up. You had gotten snatched by some crazy villain and I had no backup. I'm not suicidal," he paused, then added as an afterthought, "anymore." Wrong thing to say, apparently. He blamed the painkillers. "Which I thought you said he wasn't an idiot," Cypress said with more than a hint of amusement. Which, on the other hand, had face-bombed so hard he nearly broke his nose. "That's what I thought when I said it." Aizawa immediately hardened. Whether it had been the crack at Aizawa being taken or at his previous attempt to kill himself, he couldn't tell. It was probably both. "Look here, you little brat. I will never forgive myself for not being there. I failed you along with the rest of our students. It is my job to keep you safe, and I failed it miserably. As for you being suicidal, I really hope you have gotten that point in your life, but know that if you ever feel that way again, you can talk to me." "Dadzawa," Cypress whispered, earning a glare from both of the other alters. Izuku was slightly taken aback by the outburst and Aizawa's offer to help him. He was still wrapping his mind around the fact that people other than his mother cared. It was painfully obvious how much he cared for them all. As much as he tried to hide it behind his bitterness and salt, he truly had a caring heart. There was really only one thing to do in this situation. Izuku had his eyes filling with crocodile tears. He hadn't cried for real in over 7 months. "You truly are a Dadzawa. I'll have to tell the group chat." Aizawa blinked. He tried to hide the slight flush in his cheeks at Dadzawa, apparently unimpressed by his show. "Group chat? Between me and the fellas? Do I want to ask? Probably not." Izuku winked, then realized that Aizawa couldn't see it through the bandages smothering his sass. "Ignoring my group chat of cryptic horrors, I kinds want to know what happened after I passed out from head trauma. Getting smashed into the ground kinda makes a man black out, apparently." Not a man right now. Beetle unnecessarily chirped. Well, good thing I'm not you right now, so it doesn't matter. Izuku shot back, tone dripping with malice. Beetle continued as if she heard nothing, more she-her. They received no response. But Izuku made mental note, being a decent person and all that jazz. And you think I know? I was trapped by an arsonist. Aizawa replied lazily. Holy F-. He has a sense of humor. Cypress remarked, mirroring Izuku's thoughts exactly. Please, I've been here for a day. Netsu's already filled you in. Izuku was absolutely sure of that. Despite keeping this under control with the media and dealing with terrified parents, his mentor definitely gave old Zawa here the rundown. Fine. Netsu told me what he knew, which was a concerning amount honestly. He somehow got statements from all of our students. I said, Cypress cooed. His presence was an interesting addition to the constant mental monologue of his alters, but he was quickly making himself at home as if he hadn't popped into existence 15 minutes ago. So I want to know how our students did. Izuku gave a feline smile that still couldn't be seen. Aizawa took a seat. Apparently this was going to be detailed then. Let's start off the moment you took off and decided to join the main battle. Bakubro and him may have made tiny error. In hindsight, it probably wasn't the best idea to try and take on a villain made entirely of smoke. They hadn't know what they were doing, and because of them 13 hadn't been able to use their quirk and everyone had gotten separated. Totally not manly. Kirishima's warp landed him directly in water. See, that would be totally fine except for the fact that his quirk was activated, leaving him the weight of a Kiri-sized rock, so he immediately started sinking and there wasn't anything he could do about it. Once he realized he was dropping, he immediately deactivated his quirk, but by that time his lungs were straining and the water pressure had built up, slowly crushing his now unhardened skull. Drowning was definitely not a manly way to die, but if he didn't get up to the surface that was looking very far away, it might be how he went. In exchange for the decreasing pressure, he got black spots starting to dot his vision, the surface of the water looking more and more impossible to reach. But if he could just make it a little further, he might be able to. His train of thought was interrupted by a flash of razor-sharp teeth, and he barely had time to dodge the shark villain, their jaws missing him by only a hair. His lungs felt like they were on fire and he had to suppress the urge to draw water in. To try and breathe. If he knew he would have been in the water, he would have taken a large breath in, but he had just flown at a villain, thus causing him to take shorter breaths, thus limiting his time underwater until he drowned. However dire his breathing situation, he might not get the chance to pass out if this villain got to him first. Being part shark, the villain had amazing reflexes, spinning almost immediately after missing Kirishima. He knew he wouldn't have time to dodge this time, and if he hardened again there was no way he would make it to air. Basically, he was screwed either way. It was perhaps through sheer luck that a large body crashed into the shark villain, sending him spinning into the deeper parts of the shipwreck zone. By now his lungs felt like they were going to burst, dark spots flashing and fading as he struggled to hold his breath. Almost on autopilot, he started kicking his way to the surface, trying to make it before he passed out. Luckily, he didn't have to try hard. Almost immediately he felt water rushing past him as he was propelled faster than should have been possible. He turned to find the cause of his sudden speed boost. He caught sight of them just as his head broke the surface of the water and he took in lungfuls of air. He gave a shark-toothed grin to Sato, who was breathing just as heavily if not more so. A panting shoji thrown across his broad back. So they had picked the heaviest students to drown them, but Sato had still gotten them to safety. Super manly. Katsuki was still in some form of shock-filled rage. His plan to kill the warp villain BSRD had failed spectacularly, and now he was freezing his melons off along the invisible beach and private school. While Deku was still battling the villains in the central plaza. God FINGDMN it. There was no way this placement was pure luck. It combated their quirks too well for it to be random. The invisible chick was probably getting frostbite, being she was entirely FNG naked while the preppy beach's engines were stalling all to hell. All of Katsuki's sweat was freezing too, rendering it mostly useless. He needed to get to FING Deku now. He couldn't apologize for being such a useless a-hole child if the BSRD was FANG dead. Breaking into a dead sprint, he ignored the calls of Four Eyes. They could figure this out themselves. They were capable. Should be capable. And Deku was facing off against a sheet ton of villains Quirkless. Yeah, let's see who needs more help. Mina was not having a good day. At first, she had though this would be amazing. Spend some time with her friends and train to save people. Great, right? It would have been if villains hadn't decided to crash the part and ruin everything. Now here she was, stuck in some crumbling building with Aoyama. Both not daring to risk using their quirks for fear it might upset the delicate foundations of the building and everything would come crashing down around them. And there was a quickly advancing horde of villains approaching. That really left only one option. But when Hitoshi had thought about becoming a hero, he didn't think it would detail being attacked in a supposedly safe facility. This would certainly be more exciting than he had thought. Hell, it might have even been fun if it weren't for the fact that he was alone in screaming winds and harsh rain that carried all noise away, therefore rendering his quirk useless. If the villains couldn't hear his questions and he couldn't hear if they responded, he was basically screwed. There was something to work on in the future. Zero didn't particularly like fire. Never had, much too easy to catch his tape on fire. After all, it was flammable as fabric. But after this, he would hate it. The heat was sweltering, radiating waves in every direction. Aimed some of his tape in the wrong direction and well, whoosh. It was extremely debilitating and limited his movements quite a bit. Koda, Tokoyami, and him were back to back, trying desperately to think of a plan to fend off the villains coming from every direction. Koda's quirk was basically useless with no animals in sight and the light from the fires made dark. Shadow so weak he was more like a normal shadow than a sentient one. Nothing was coming to mind, but if they didn't figure this out they would be so screwed. Kaminari wasn't an idiot, despite what his test scores might say. He was smart enough to know that things were going downhill. Literally. The ground was sloped, buildings partially submerged in the dirt. Villains prepared to battle him and Gyre. He could take them all out, but he could up accidentally hitting his classmate. She had no way of escaping the blast, and he had no way of sparing her from his electricity. While he wasn't an idiot, he wasn't the best tactician either. No offense to Gyru, but they had left all the master plan makers somewhere else, and they had no means of knocking out these many villains without the full extent of Kaminari's quirk. But if the villains got any closer, they might just have to risk it. Ojiro was stranded. Alone in the mountain zone, backed into a corner with villains forming a tight semicircle around him. His only two options were to try and launch himself over them or over the hills at his back. Neither was the best, but he needed to do something. Momo was angry at the warp villain in front of her who had warped her friends away and Mineta who would not stop ogling her. He needed to get some professionalism. They were facing off against a villain and all he could do was stare at her BRTS when she created a staff. 13 was in front of them, finger poised to create a black hole to SCK up the villain. Momo hoped it would work, but she was still on edge. Couldn't the villain theoretically create a warp gate behind 13 and have them accidentally use their quirk on themselves? And then Kurogyri used his quirk on 13 and they got turned partially into dust. Luckily, All Might showed up a little while later. He was already on his way and got there just in time to save everyone. Aizawa finished, obviously bored at having to tell the story by his oversimplifications. Wow. Beetle really knows their sheet. Izuku remarked drily. I didn't think my placements would be so effective. Beetle clapped her hands in pride. Someone might have actually gotten killed if All Might hadn't magically appeared along with the rest of the staff. It's too bad Uraraka got them out early and the school was alerted, sad face. Which glared at the villainous altar. You don't actually want them dead. You like them just as much as Izuku does. Beetle sighed dreamily. Todoroki's hot. Cypress and Witch exchanged a look. You two wouldn't know if SXL attraction if it hit you with a stick, Beetle pouted. Izuku, back me up here. Shoshan's is really pretty. Speaking of Todoroki, he really needed to get a hustle on ruining Endeavor's life like he had ruined Rei's. Well, it's great that no one got super hurt. Class right. Izuku said, flinging off his blankets and swinging out of bed. Aizawa looked slightly alarmed and shook his head. You are not going to class. Nope, Izuku said, popping the pea. Don't tell me that you wouldn't go to class if it was you in my place. Aizawa didn't deny it. Besides, recovery girl patched me up. I really don't need all of these bandages. Izuku shrugged, ignoring the pain that ran down his still healing arms at the simple action. Aizawa grumbled, fine. But your mother in on her way and you aren't leaving this room until she's gone. Izuku froze. He had totally forgotten about that. An hour later Izuku was making his way down the hall to Class 1A. The meeting with Inko had been less than pleasant, her crying and scolding making him feel guilty in a way he didn't think were possible. Even Beetle, someone who had actually murdered people, felt cowed by the end of the exchange. Yikes, let's repress those memories, shall we? Besides, he had the opportunity for a dramatic entrance and he didn't want to be bogged down by his mother's tears of relief. Before long he was standing at the comically oversized door to the classroom. He could hear activity on the other side and knew that Aizawa was teaching a lesson. Perfect time for some strategic interruption. He kicked open the door, ow, before striding into the classroom. The students were staring open-mouthed, obviously not expecting him to be back so soon. Aizawa only looked slightly irritated at being cut off. His bandages were trailing behind him like some weird wedding train and both Cypress and Beetle were cackling. Which was as resigned as normal. Butting Aizawa out of his spot at the front of the room, the underground hero realized this would take a while and settled into his sleeping bag, opting to take a nap on the floor. I just want to say how proud I am that you all survived. Izuku smiled at the class, although they couldn't see it through the FING bandages. The expressions of the students ranged from Uraraka's slightly disapproving shock to Kaken's relief. He ignored Cypress' growl when his eyes locked with Kaken's red irises. The pure rage rippling off the pink-haired altar was almost debilitating, but he pushed through the dizzying potency of emotion. As a reward you get. Drum roll please. No one drum rolled to Beetle's dismay. More training. The room collectively groaned and Izuku could feel the satisfaction rippling off Aizawa. Great job not dying. I truly applaud you on that. Izuku patted his aviator jacket, looking for his cigarettes. He was having some serious nicotine withdrawals. He mentally swore which reminded him he couldn't smoke in the classroom, but Kaken here was the only one who actually managed to escape the villains and help me. He was nearly knocked to his knees by the viciousness radiating off Cypress at his borderline compliment. He deserves no praise. And this must be why Witch didn't want Cypress here. There was some serious resentment harbored in the Cypress heart. Mental note, don't let Cypress be in control around Kaken. Based on the rage coming from the altar, he felt it might end in bloodshed. So basically you guys need to get better on getting more creative with your quirks. I can think of probably a dozen ways you could have done just fine in the environment meant to directly combat your quirks as they are now. Some students blushed, embarrassed at apparently failing. That isn't something to be ashamed of. Jesus, we've been in school for like a month. You're doing great, kids. Izuku realized he was sounding an awful lot like Aizawa and was slightly mortified. But Deku-sensei, you are literally our age. In fact, 6 people here are older than you. Uraraka said with an angelic smile that masked her true evil. Izuku frowned. That frown only deepened when Shinso spoke up from the back of the class. Plus everyone is taller than you. You're tiny. His alters hissed in unison. Izuku stomped towards Shinso's desk. Still mummified but obviously offended. Look here, you little beach. Just because you can reach the top of the fridge doesn't mean you are superior. Shinso smiled lazily. I could drop kick you across the training field. You're what? 5 feet. Oh, that was it. Kick his, but Cypress growled, shortly followed by Beetle's agreement and Witch's silent glower of approval. Me you right now. And just like that everything went fuzzy. Time moved like molasses and nothing seemed to make sense. Oh, that FANG BS dirty. Then he was back. Well, not back, which was in his place. Interesting. Apparently, Shinso could only brainwash them one at a time. He had yet to have a training session with the kids, so it was good information to have. Which gave up command, and just like that there was Izuku blinking at Shinso who looked all too smug. You are aware you used your quirk on a teacher. I could expel you. Much to his delight, Shinso's eyes widened and soft gasps sounded through the student body. Holy crap, Shinso brainwashed Midoriya-sensei, and he broke out of it? No one was more surprised than Shinso, obviously trying to figure out how Izuku had broken free and now slightly panicked at the prospect of expulsion. Izuku considered for a moment, letting Shinsu's mind run to all the worst possible places. Nah. I did challenge you first after all. Fair play. Tension visibly bled out of Shinsu's shoulders, and he averted his gaze. Izuku clapped his hands. Wonderful. Now I think Aizawa wants to get back to the lesson and I need to find new ways to train you. No one looked convinced he meant train. Everyone who had come back from a training session had ultimately passed out. Even Todoroki. Aizawa was pulling himself out of his sleeping bag and Izuku headed towards his desk in the back corner of the room. Pulling out his notebooks from the storage cabinet, he began to write something special for Shinso and Uraraka. FING devils. Later, when class was being dismissed, he hurried to catch Todoroki. What are you doing on midnight Saturday? He asked, catching Todoroki unaware. Why? Izuku tried to give him a blinding smile through his bandages. I want to discuss Endeavor's impending doom. Todoroki blinked. Really, the man's emotions were locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Where do you want to meet? I'll just come to your house. Todoroki's voice was carefully neutral. Are you sure that's the best plan? Izuku scoffed. It'll be fine. Todoroki gave the smallest frown. See you then. Which ended up having to tackle Cypress to keep him from either slitting Shigaraki's throat or beating his face in with his bare fists if the broken glass proved ineffective. Both options would end with at least one of them dead, so it wasn't very popular among everyone else. In hindsight, they should have expected this. Cypress was obviously very protective of Izuku and had more anger issues than Kaken with significantly looser morals. Bringing said burning ball of rage and vengeance to the man that resulted in multiple broken bones, massive facial damage, and very near death was probably not the best idea. They had been smart enough to avoid Kaken like the plague in the brief time they had been in the same room after Izuku had joined the class again. None of them had missed the glares Cypress had thrown Kaken from the back of the class. If looks could kill, Kaken would have been tortured and murdered 10 times over. Izuku couldn't say it wasn't refreshing to have someone willing to fight for him and to try and right the wrongs done to him in his childhood. Even if it was still ultimately himself. He honestly wouldn't have a problem with it if he hadn't already made peace with the past and it wasn't technically his body doing the punching, so, therefore, him getting blamed. Apparently, nothing screws with your moral compass more than throwing yourself off a roof and burning your dreams. They, meaning everyone except which who vehemently disagreed, had somehow decided to pay a visit to the League and see how they were faring after the whole failure of the USJ. There was a difference of opinions between them, which still being salty he had to do all the work, Izuku being salty he had gotten the sheet beat out of him, and Beetle being somewhere between curious and concerned. Toga and Dabi hadn't participated in the battle, being they were more powerful than what the League had deemed necessary. Obviously, a mistake, but Shigaraki was bound to be furious, and when furious, Shigaraki had a tendency to disintegrate things. If Kurogyari or Sensei couldn't reel him in, the results would be unfavorable. Beetle was also a curious little sheet who couldn't help but rub salt in a wound. Cypress' silence really should have been a tip towards the whole shanking Shigaraki in the throat thing. Around 11 p.m. Izuku had transformed to Beetle and let the borderline villain take control. They had skipped to Kurogyari's bar, which giving him tips on how not to set off an already temperamental Shigaraki and not be turned to dust. Cypress was silent the entire way, but he had been a presence for less than a day and it wasn't hard to forget he existed. Now they realized Cypress had been plotting Shigaraki's demise. Fantasizing revenge and murder, or at least injury. Yikes again. When they reached the bar, Shigaraki hadn't been in the main room, although you could tell he had been in the main room. There were stools missing and tables having mysteriously vanished. Presumably disintegrated, but for all Beetle knew they could have been some fire involved because to Dabi this was an opportunity to set things ablaze. He couldn't deny the appeal. Fire was pretty. He had based his whole look off it after all. Speaking of Dabi, the villain was sprawled on the few remaining bar stools nursing a glass of whiskey beside Toga, who had some bubbling pink thing in a champagne flute. Heathens. Kurogyari was polishing glasses behind the bar and had almost dropped the cup when Beetle had skipped through the door. Beetle was still half mummified, although he had removed the bandages around his eyes and mouth, being they were the most defining features besides his signature hair. However, he felt it wasn't his condition that shocked our dear Mother Void. "What are you doing here?" Kurogiri demanded, more in shock than anger. Dabi and Toga had both dramatically spun around in their stools. Dabi looking furious and Toga delighted. "What are you doing here?" Dabi growled, blue fire flickering to life in his palm. "Yikes, superscript 3. Explain right now. Dabi's too strong for me to take without weapons, especially if Toga and Kurogiri get involved." Which commanded, already looking for an exit in case things went downhill. "Relax, Dabi-kun. I didn't even do anything. I kept my end of the bargain." Beetle grinned, sweeping into the only remaining vacant stool. "Wasn't even me. Plus, we didn't actually cause the plan to fail. We told Tamura to stand down and he didn't. He postponed the battle to try and kill me. It wasn't even my fault All Might wasn't there." Toga took a sip of her pink drink before giving him a flash of sharp teeth. "Who's we?" Beetle gave her returning smirk. "Would you like to meet them?" Toga nodded furiously while Dabi still seemed trying to leash his anger and wrap his mind around the fact that there was a we. Despite Witch's protests, he was suddenly shoved into the spotlight. The madness faded from Beetle's eyes and was replaced with exhaustion that can only be achieved by being the only voice of reason among 3 other completely irrational people. "Kurogiri, from one mom to another, please, for the love of God, pour me a drink. Not that horrible concoction Beetle gets. I don't care what it is. Whatever you take when you're tired of dealing with all of them," he said, gesturing towards Dabi and Toga. Toga's eyes were filled with stars and Dabi was whispering a soft, "What the F dash," under his breath as he stared body that had once possessed his friend. Kurogiri mercifully complied, sending a glass of amber liquid Witch's way. The warp villain seemed surprisingly fine with the fact that the villain he had come to know had pulled a complete 180. Going from a Toga to a Kurogiri in the space of a second. Witch drowned the glass in one gulp and gestured for another. "Are you really Witch?" Toga demanded, practically bouncing with excitement. Dabi was now in a full-fledged existential crisis and was just staring at Witch with unblinking eyes. "Unfortunately, I am also the only mildly sane one of the group, and despite my warning to not reveal our true identities, we did so majority rules, I guess." Witch sighed, rubbing his temples, trying to stave off an approaching headache. "I am also the one who will actually accurately answer your questions, so ask away." Toga's eyes lit up. "What are you? A quirk or something else?" Kurogiri returned with Witch's refill, which he graciously accepted. "Dissociative identity disorder. Nothing to do with quirks or otherwise. Mental defense mechanism. Officially I'm called an alter for Izuku Midoriya, whom you will probably meet shortly. We are an interesting case where we have entire control on when we switch. It's really hard to accurately explain, so just run with it." Dabi finally ripped himself from his shock and with a quizzical expression asked, "Wait, so you're all the same person?" "More or less. Entirely different people, but only one body to share with. Our sole purpose is to help Izuku. Perhaps in some unorthodox ways, but that is always our goal." "But you care for me?" Izuku cooed, causing Witch to noticeably frown. Seeing Toga pp her head and Dabi to narrow his eyes, he decided to explain, "We can talk to each other in our mind." "That is so cool!" Toga exclaimed, spinning the stool like a child. Which directed his attention to Kurogiri. "It is literally having Beetle plus 2 others in your head 24/7. The warp villain visibly winced. "I pity you. Free feel to come by and get a free drink anytime." Which gave him a grateful smile and downed his glass. "Thank you. We aren't that bad." Beetle pouted. "Yes, you are now shut up while I try and fix your problems so we don't get incinerated." "Kurogiri!" An ear-splitting shout rattled the bottles of the bar as a more bedraggled than usual Shigaraki stormed into the bar. Whatever he wanted was quickly and obviously forgotten as he saw the fiery twin buns of Beetle. They both snapped at the same time. The outside observer, they could see the shift as Witch lost control and Cypress was in his place. Feel the pure rage rippling off the previously exhausted but calm alter. It was jarring and everyone except Shigaraki were too stunned to do anything as Cypress smashed the empty glass and grabbed a jagged shard, oblivious to how it cut into his own palm. Shigaraki was still enraged by the USJ failure, and when once again faced with its supposed saboteur, the still boiling anger was once again reignited and he charged Cypress with all intent to kill. The difference this time being that Cypress had all intentions of murder as well. Internally, Cypress was battling off who was trying to regain control. Beetle and Izuku were half-heartedly trying to contribute, but neither being physical fighters, they both knew they didn't stand much of a chance and would only get in the way. Cypress and Shigaraki were engaged in a deadly dance of broken glass and dangerous touches. Toga and Dabi were ultimately too amused to do anything, and Kurogyari couldn't find a good opening. Luckily, both Shigaraki and Cypress were holding their own, avoiding the other as to stop the catastrophic injury that would surely ensue if they got struck. Kurogyari was relentlessly trying to find a way to stop the brawl, but if he warped between them there was the risk of accidentally dismembering one or both if it was misplaced. Meanwhile, which was winning the mental clash, but Cypress was putting up a decent fight, using his bat to his advantage as both a defensive and offensive weapon. Cypress was too far gone to actively care if he caused permanent harm, but which had much more experience. A swing of the bat that which barely ducked, the vigilante's legs moving to try and sweep Cypress to the floor. The pink-haired alter jumped just in time to avoid his legs being knocked out from under him. He, however, wasn't in time to avoid the fist to his face that left him with a bleeding nose. In retaliation, he moved to hit Witch in the head with enough force it would bash in his skull. Witch dodged the blow, opting to keep his head, but he didn't have time for it to avoid him completely, and it hit his shoulder with a sickening pop. On anyone else, a dislocated shoulder would be debilitating and they would be rolling on the floor in agony or at least gritting their teeth. But Witch fought villains for a living. And this was hardly the worst injury he had received. Far from it, in fact. The perks of knowing a villain who had a healing quirk and making them indebted to you. Insane pain tolerance was something all of the alters along with Izuku were all blessed with, due to their various occupations and, in Izuku's case, upbringing. So, Witch didn't even flinch when he knocked his shoulder back into place. Shigaraki continued trying to murder Cypress, trying and failing to wrap his hands around Cypress' throat and turn it to dust. Of course, Cypress wasn't all that keen on the idea and instead opted to run point blank into Shigaraki, causing them both to topple to the ground in a heap. It was honestly a miracle that Shigaraki didn't touch anything valuable, and even more of a miracle that Cypress was able to get his knees onto the back of the villain's hands, so they only succeeded in disintegrating the floorboards. By now Cypress was grinning with enough bloodlust in his eyes it even made Dabi gulp and Kurogyari actually start to panic. How would he be able to save Tamura without hurting Cypress? If push came to shove he would kill Cypress. Although he didn't know which alter it was, he was smart enough to realize it wasn't Beetle or Witch, and they had obviously lost control. And as Cypress raised the shard of broken glass tinted pink with his blood where he clutched it too hard and moved to very gruesomely stab it into Shigaraki's exposed neck. Kurogyari readied to decapitate the out-of-control alter when a voice rang in over the speakers. Enough! None of the alters had ever met the elusive sensei, and Cypress was still new. But even he was aware of the man's power and quirks. Hearing the voice for the first time caused him to pause for a nanosecond. It was that nanosecond that let Witch finally tackle Cypress and retake control. Kurogyari visibly slumped with relief when he saw the same bone weariness he associated with Witch overtake the pure rage of the mystery alter. Witch stepped off Shigaraki, who shakily got to his feet, trembling with fury and glaring hard enough to kill. Kurogyari recognized that would not end well and forcefully warped Shigaraki out of the area. Sorry about that. New Avenger alter. Not too happy about being nearly killed earlier. Witch said, panting with exertion as he discarded the blood-stained glass and examined the wound on his hand. Shallow, bandaging would be fine. At some point, one of Beetle's buns had fallen out of the pins that held it together and there was a small waterfall of fiery hair. Witch absent-mindedly retied it as he focused on pinning a still raging Cypress down for good. Get a hold of yourself. Shigaraki's an ally. This is why I didn't want you to ever join us. Witch snarled at the Avenger alter who was being held down by Izuku and Beetle. Cypress hissed. Actually hissed. Like a cat. Beetle looked far too delighted to be healthy and Izuku just looked detached. Having deemed this as not really his problem. They seemed to have it under control, so he focused back on the physical world and placating the villains who just watched their pseudo-leader be attacked. That was Cypress. He has opinions. We just got him today and we're not anticipating that show and we beg your forgiveness. He was more directing his voice to Sensei, who would probably be a lot more upset than Dabi and Toga. They were villains who thrived on chaos and didn't particularly care for Shigaraki. He doubted they really cared, but Sensei. Yikes, ×4. There was a PRD silence as Dabi just kind of blinked and Toga flitted to her champagne glass and took a dainty sip before pausing and then just downing it. Which was literally internally cursing Cypress for his lack of tact or really any logic past, murder the ones who've wronged you. He had thought Beetle was bad, but this was an entirely new level. I would like to finally meet you in person, young Beetle, or witch, or whoever you are at the moment. I feel like it would be an educational experience for all of us. Sensei finally said, causing Witch to have a small panic attack. Sensei could very well want to kill him, or maybe he just wanted to talk. It could be beneficial or benign for all he knew. Sensei's voice betrayed absolutely nothing of his intentions, and the range of possibilities was staggering to the point that it was horrifying. Kurogyri will be back momentarily and then he will take you to me so we can chat. That is if you would allow. There was hardly a choice. None at all really. He couldn't turn it down, and if he was being totally honest, he didn't want to turn it down. Beetle had been pestering Shigaraki for a meeting for months and now he finally got the chance. Please, 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 Witch-kun. I want to meet him so bad. Beetle pleaded, almost going so far as removing his hands from the still volatile Cypress to beg. As if he had the option to decline. I would be honored, Sensei. 5 minutes and 6 drinks later, Kurogyri appeared and stretched his body into a decently sized doorway, then Witch hesitantly stepped through. Not sure if it would truly lead to Sensei or his ultimate demise. Perhaps both. The feeling was somewhat surreal. It lasted for less than a second, but in that brief moment, all gravity was abandoned as the very air shifted and Witch was transported to an entirely different location. There were no noticeable features in the room. Slate gray walls. No doors and no windows. Only a small plain set of chairs and a table in the center. A single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling casting a dim light. There was nothing to indicate where he was, but also nothing that could obviously be used to kill him. That included Sensei, who was conspicuously missing from the claustrophobic meeting room. Kurogyri's warp gate disappeared and he was trapped. Alarm bells started ringing immediately. Something was wrong. Why wasn't Sensei here? Did he have some sort of invisibility quirk? Was this just some ploy to kill him for what happened to Shigaraki? Relax. He's a villain. We all have a bit of a flair for dramatics. Beetle reassured with an insane smile. Cypress had been deemed stable enough to be released and was chain smoking in the corner. Simultaneously sulking and being manageably said that he hadn't been able to kill Shigaraki, but also slightly ashamed that he had caused so many problems and accomplished nothing. Which hesitantly took a seat in one of the plain folding chairs by the table. Mind wandering to the possible outcomes of this meeting. Was he upset that they had interfered with USJ? On the entire opposite end, could this be a good thing? Was Sensei officially recruiting them? Suddenly there was a man occupying the opposite seat. Witch's reflexes had him tensing before he really realized what was happening. The man towered over him. He wore a plain white dress suit and suit jacket. His most defining feature was his face, however. Or perhaps the complete lack of it. Witch knew better than to stare, but in the brief glance, he could see there was nothing but scar tissue. He had a mouth, but everything else was just mangled flesh. There were no eyes, no nose, nothing. Tubes jutted out of his neck and jaw that were most likely connected to some sort of support system. Beetle knew Sensei's history. His leading of Japan in the shadows all those years ago and his extended lifespan. His fight with All Might that left him his current state and his extremely overpowered quirk along with his true name, All for One. It was because of that knowledge that Witch didn't dismiss him as not being dangerous and denouncing him as a pitiful mess. He was very well aware that Sensei could kill him with half a thought and no amount of training could change that. If even All Might couldn't take him down, then a quirkless teenager wouldn't so much as make a dent. Beetle seemed disappointed he wasn't more imposing, but in Witch's opinion, it was just fine. Let me start this off by first apologizing for Shigaraki's behavior at the USJ. He should have known better than try and kill a potential ally. All for One said, folding his hands. Witch blinked along with everyone besides Cypress, who was ignoring everything. An apology? That was not what on the list of possible statements. Now to whom am I speaking? I'm assuming Witch, being you don't have Beetle's signature eye gleam of madness, and Cypress would be an unfavorable choice for this particular meeting. But I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Izuku, so I can't be sure. It took every ounce of bravery from every fight with villains and brushes with the police to keep his voice from shaking when he responded to the most powerful man in Japan. You are correct in your assumption. Izuku would probably be an unfavorable choice as well, being he has no sense of self-preservation and would sass you into tomorrow. Wow, even facing possible death you still find a way to bad-talk me, Izuku said dryly, having taken post by Cypress to share cigarettes and was braiding his neon pink hair. Stop smoking. It's bad for your health. Which chastised, says the man who just had 8 glasses of bourbon. Touché. All for One laughed, and Which almost flinched. How exactly do you fare with having them every moment then? I can barely deal with the 3 I have, and I have Kurogiri to assist. Not that I'm complaining. I never did thank you for bringing Dabi and Toga to me all those months ago. It's nice to have some people other than low-level thugs. Seeing as this was directed at Beetle, he let his briefly take control but carefully monitored what he said. All for One's reason for this meeting was not yet clear, and they couldn't run the risk of offending him. Thank you, sir. They would be powerful on their own, but they shared similar ideals as you and Tamura, so I figured it would be even better united. Beetle said, grinning with stars in his eyes. All for One nodded. It was the correct call. Beetle smiled one last time before Witch took over again. Forgive me, sir, but I feel the need to ask the nature of this meeting. I sincerely apologize for Cypress' behavior and for undermining you with our affiliation to UA. We never meant to betray you, and in all honesty, we technically didn't. Right down to business. I respect that. Let me first ease your fears by first that I have no intention of killing you. Consider yourself forgiven for all possible wrongdoings. The reason for this meeting is only to discuss ways we can both benefit from your multiple lives. Red flags so large Which was worried All for One would be able to see them too immediately started waving. With all due respect, we like to keep each of our lives from interfering with the other. This is a special case where it can't be avoided, but we would like to continue each of our detachments. Mostly due to our different moral codes and how ambiguous our individual morals are overall. I understand, and I would like to honor that. All I'm asking is that you cater to our needs in regards to taking down the hero industry and continuously supplying us with information on UA's movements. The villain said, leaning forward. Izuku's voice rang in Witch's head, and in all honesty Witch was inclined to agree. Ask him what we get in return. Beetle said, ever the businessman. We are not official members of the League and therefore will not betray UA without a price. If All for One had eyes which thought they probably would be twinkling, I would have been disappointed if you didn't demand to be paid. I have prepared a list that I feel would be suitable. Interest thorough piqued, Which leaned forward. Oh? Our word to try and spare whomever you wish, and giving you Beetle's quirk for real. You won't have to rely on Dabi to do your dirty work. Holy sheet. Cypress said, head snapping up from his pity party. Holyshit. Beetle and Izuku echoed. Which was too much in shock to do anything but stare. Does that quirk even truly exist? And you have it in your possession? All for One smiled. Tamura recommended the idea for your fake quirk, no? Let's just say he got the basics from me. I don't see a reason why we shouldn't take this. Beetle said, grinning. He had been gunning for getting a quirk for months, and now it was more than just a random quirk. It was his quirk. Being quirkless is kind of our thing, though. I want to be powerful without relying on a quirk. Izuku interjected with uncertain eyes. But the quirk isn't really good for anything other than what I plan to use it for. The rest of you wouldn't even have a chance or a need to use it. Beetle was practically begging now. Plus it keeps the League from withholding Dabi in case we have a falling out. which said slowly, "There was no denying from a logical standpoint this was a good deal, and we would have just kept making deals like the one we made for the USJ. This guarantees that we can keep the people we want safe. We already have more money than we know what to do with. I say we take it," Cypress said with a nod to which, "I agree." Izuku grumbled but seemed to come to the same conclusion. Beetle looked overjoyed and no one could blame him. "We accept your offer. However, once we receive the quirk, we would like to make a contract using said quirk to guarantee the safety of the designated people." Which said they needed to make sure they stood by their word. Of course. Being it was technically Beetle's quirk, which didn't want to risk being the one to receive it. Based on what happened with Shinso quirks may only affect one of them at a time and which didn't want to even have a chance of being the only one with access. For this he let a very enthusiastic Beetle take over. Gaining a quirk felt weird. It was like the blood in his body was being replaced. For a moment it felt like nothing happened and then a sudden wave of dizziness hit so hard Beetle had to grab onto the table for support. His vision swam and he felt nauseous. It stayed like this for a few moments and then it disappeared. Like it had never happened at all. Except, there was a feeling in his gut that was foreign and hot. For a second Witch panicked. What if All for One had tricked them and had given them a deadly quirk? Beetle wasn't at all concerned and proved Witch wrong by digging into the mysterious heat. He could mentally picture the contract, that the power behind the letters that would bring it to life. It was odd but not unwelcome. By now it had grafted to his subconscious and it was like another limb. "I had a feeling you would ask to use that quirk on me, so I brought along some paper for that contract," All for One said, pulling out a stack of parchment and a pen. Using the quirk was surprisingly easy. All he had to do was tap into that warmth and force the power from it into the paper, the letters glowing slightly with every written word. The contract itself was straightforward and simple. It guaranteed the League does everything in their power to guarantee the safety of every student in Class 1, minus Katsuki and Mineta, along with Aizawa and present Mike. Beetle had months of experience excluding loopholes from contracts much like this and specially wrote in space to add names if needed. He also outlined that fact that under no circumstances would All for One be able to take the quirk back unless asked. In return, Beetle would supply whatever information the League wanted on UA with no other cost. The penalty for both parties would be death if they failed to keep their end of the bargain. Fire was unreliable in this situation, being they couldn't be sure if he had a fire resistance quirk. All for One read it over once it was completed. He seemed to deem it good enough and signed his name with a flourish. Mentally Beetle felt the contract appear, telling him its status and terms. It was like a handcuff, tying him and Sensei together. "Thank God. Lord, does that save me a lot of bookkeeping?" Beetle said happily, "although I will have to go and resign my other clients. It's been a pleasure doing business with you. I look forward to our future partnership. Kurogyri will take you back to the bar." All for One nodded, gesturing at the open warp gate behind Beetle. Bowing Beetle let a brilliant smile sneak onto his face as he melted into Kurogyri and retreated to the bar. "Well, that went much better than expected," Beetle said, skipping down the street. They had spent another 4 hours fully explaining everything to Dabi, Toga, Kurogyri, and a still furious Shigaraki. Cypress had apparently somewhat gotten over it. Still said but not actively trying to kill the villains, so a step in the right direction. Which had made him formally apologize, and he did, but only after he left Shigaraki cradling his nose and Cypress looking far too smug but ultimately satisfied. Which had placed him in timeout after that, but being Kurogyri persuaded Shigaraki not to disintegrate his face, and Dabi and Toga just looked overall overjoyed at Tamura's plight, which had begrudgingly let them meet the altar. Turns out Cypress and Dabi were practically brothers and had clicked so completely it was almost scary. They had spent half an hour arguing if wrapping a bat in barbed wire was better than a metal bat that had been heated up. By the end for that conversation, which was actually considering investing in a doomsday bunker, and Beetle casually interjecting ship comments with Toga. Dabi had threatened to burn both of them, and Cypress gave Beetle a death glare so potent the informant had squeaked and hid behind which. Surprisingly, Izuku and Shigaraki got on like a house on fire. Izuku geeking out with Tamura over the newest video game and fanboying over strategies. Izuku even got Shigaraki to play co-op with him, which Kurojiiri had looked impressed by. Which and Kurojiiri probably hadn't been the best role models for their respective wards, opting to spend their time drinking far too much alcohol and complaining about how much their kids were pains in their butt, which shared some embarrassing stories about Izuku and Beetle that had Izuku's face a bright red and Beetle terrified of Witch's power. Cypress had been howling in laughter, secretly glad he had only been on the roster for a day, which should probably do something about their respective addictions. Izuku and Cypress apparently shared a love for cigarettes, although Cypress sometimes substituted nicotine with bubblegum, and which wasn't anything but self-aware, so he knew the alcohol thing was most likely an issue that should be addressed. Yikes, that's what 5 times now? Minus the near-death experience in the beginning. Izuku added to Beetle's previous statement, earning a hard glare from both Witch and Cypress. Not that I'm complaining. He raised his hands defensively. It's only that you didn't succeed. Succeed? Succeed in what? Killing Handyman? Cypress inquired, blowing a pink bubble that popped with a snap. I like Tamura. Killing me is what I meant. Everyone abruptly stopped walking and turned to stare at Izuku. Are you going to throw yourself off another building? If you are, we are obliged to forcefully take over and drag your butt to the nearest mental hospital. Which said with a hard edge in his voice that marked it as his mom voice. Apparently not drunk enough to not intervene with a suicide joke. Izuku had the audacity to look shocked. Jesus, no. Can't a guy make one joke about killing himself without being put on a watch list? Just look at our generation. We're all doing it. It would be fine if you A, hadn't actually tried to kill yourself, and B, if we hadn't literally been created to stop that from happening. Izuku grumbled but couldn't disagree. The next morning, Izuku awoke to his alarm blasting Verka Serduchka from the 2007 Eurovision contest with a nasty hangover. He mentally cursed Witch for being irresponsible and drinking so much with Kurojiiri. That's technically your guy's fault for driving me to become an alcoholic. Witch mumbled, voice still muffled by sleep. You're so much more brass when you're sleepy, Cypress whispered, more seductively than anyone, much less a demisexual, should ever know how to do, not a hair's breadth away from his ear. Which woke up and backhanded him. Apparently, Cypress was still drunk. An hour later, a uselessly mummified Izuku rolled into UA, ready to initiate his new torturous training plans on his unknowing victims. Victims he had now saved from being actually tortured to death by the League in a very odd but worthwhile deal made with the most powerful man in Japan. It was safe to say last night's video game altered haze of memories were starting to come back together, and HOLYSHIT. Those were the only 2 words to describe what had happened. They were up a quirk and up in safety of his students. The only price was knowledge about UA that Beetle probably would have given anyway, with no way to guarantee that the League would keep their deal. Now he knew for certain that none of his students would intentionally be injured. He couldn't deny the fact that he had been a bit swamped with guilt at only saving 4 people in the USJ attack. He hadn't wanted to push his luck, but he still felt like a piece of shit for leaving Kirishima, a literal ball of sunshine who deserved the world in Izuku's humble opinion, and Shinso, sassy mofo that he admittedly had started to like, especially after yesterday's debacle, along with the rest of Class 1A to drown. So now knowing that he had a quirk that ensured their safety was something of a relief. Did he mention that Beetle wouldn't shut up about his quirk? Yeah, that was happening. Witch and a still tipsy Cypress had both helped him shove the rambling alter into a mental closet before promptly going back to sleep. If you listen very carefully, you could still hear Beetle fanboying? Girling? Beetle was using they them right now, so who knows over his quirk, but it was mostly silence, thank God. It brought back flashbacks to his former hero studying days. He almost wished he hadn't burnt those notebooks. If only so he could scoff at his bad notes and even worse drawings. Almost was the key word in that statement. Anyway, he had just walked into class when Aizawa told him to immediately turn around and go to Nedzu's office because the mammal wanted to talk to him. He and Nedzu met every Tuesday and Thursday for special classes on how to manipulate people and plan sophisticated attacks, but today was Wednesday, so this must be something important. Of course, everything deemed important to Nedzu ranged from a tea leaf in the bottom of his cup looking like the Jabberwocky to finding a villain hideout. didn't really give him many parameters. So there he was, sprawled on a chair in Nedzu's office, teacup in hand and sunglasses slapped over his eyes indoors like an a-hole. I suppose you're wondering why I brought you here. Although if you didn't already have an idea, then I would be thoroughly disappointed. The rat chuckled, taking a sip of lukewarm leaf juice. Nedzu wasn't wrong. Izuku had an idea. Multiple ideas, in fact. Some great like, I'm retiring so you take the school as my protege, to, I know you're Beetle and you're being arrested. Everything in that range seemed highly improbable, so there was really only one thing that stood out. The sports festival, Izuku said, casually pouring his leaf juice into a flask for later use. Nedzu clapped his paws. Correct. Now you know that UA isn't made of money and we do have a budget, but it is a very large budget along, plus we have pros who can manipulate basically anything. Izuku slowly nodded. He had an idea of where this was going and he loved it. And since we have such resources at our disposal, we have decided to up our ambitions for this year's festival, which will be held in 2 weeks. Izuku didn't question whether it would be the best idea to hold the festival so soon after the USJ attack. Nope. He knew it was a political move, showing Shigaraki and the League along with the rest of Japan that they wouldn't be cowed by some thugs. I've also decided that it would be a wonderful time for an exam for you. Izuku was really liking where this was going. As a test, you will be designing the second challenge of the first-year festival along with narrating the event with Yamada and Aizawa. Izuku would swear there were literally stars in his eyes. He got to design an event for the sports festival. And he got to host it as well. This was better than getting a quirk. You Beetle and Ifo, this was so much better. You will have every resource at your disposal and you can consult anyone except me. I want to be surprised. Nedzu finished, eyes twinkling with the same excitement. I won't let you down, Principal Nedzu. This festival will be one for the history books. They both gave each other a frighteningly sadistic smile. For some reason, every first year, along with their teachers, collectively gulped. Thanks.